Chapter 505. Paul frowned and suddenly felt a little uneasy. The person who could suddenly make a move on the battlefield of the invincible realm and save Xianxia at the critical moment was undoubtedly in the invincible realm. But in Paul's perception, the other party's state was extremely strange, or in other words, his realm was very chaotic. His realm seemed to have just entered the invincible realm and could not be stabilized. But even Paul was amazed by the speed that broke out in an instant. His own defense and attack were not excellent. In the shadow domain, his strongest point was the strange attack that was impossible to guard against. To put it bluntly, this kind of martial art style was actually a real assassin. Paul was the patriarch of Rothschild, not an assassin. But his style had already been determined. The upper and lower limits of the top assassins were infinite. Similarly, the top assassins often did not pay much attention to the strength on paper in the battle. Most of the examples of the weak defeating the strong in the dark world were created by the assassins. To some extent, the assassins who were flexible and strange and could kill with one blow were the easiest people to create miracles. Paul could be said to be at the peak in this field. So he was not afraid of Arsis, whose strength was stronger than his on paper. In the domain of Qingtong, he was even more confident. But the most troublesome thing for him was to face the top assassins in the dark world. Who was the strongest assassin in the dark world? This question might have been controversial more than 3 years ago, but with the death of Jiang Qianxia of the Jiang family of South America in the final battle of Heaven Capital, all the controversies no longer existed. In this era, there was only one strongest assassin, and he was also the only assassin of the invincible realm in the dark world. Sai City, Zhongzhou State. Tribulation. Paul stared at the silver mask in front of him. All his emotions were restrained, and he became serious and serious. Lord of Shadow? Paul asked softly, with an indescribable emotion in his tone. Thank you, Your Highness. Xianxia, who was shocked and stable, took a deep breath, but his face was still a little pale. The moment just now was very short, but it was the closest he had ever been to death in his life. The feeling of brushing past death could be said to be unforgettable, so his thanks were also very sincere. I owe you a life. Tribulation shook his head slowly and suddenly glanced at Mellad. Mellad was stunned, and then he understood what tribulation meant. Without the slightest hesitation, he directly stretched out his hand, and an extremely pure light suddenly bloomed in his hand. The light was like a tide, surging and converging, and finally fell on tribulation. The gate of hope. This was the gate of hope that Mellad had personally opened. This light was so pure and dazzling. Even though it had been worn out by the shadows of Qingtong and Paul, it was still like the brightest star in the night sky. Paul's eyes were cold. Mellad could understand what tribulation meant, so could he. In the shadows, almost no one was able to capture his movements with his battle prowess just now. But now there was tribulation. Tribulation's body was glowing. As long as tribulation could keep up with Paul's speed, under the light, Paul's advantage would be mostly wasted. The dazzling light wrapped around tribulation. Under the silver mask, tribulation's eyes were cold and indifferent. Paul's figure began to slowly retreat. Tribulation seemed to move. The dazzling light seemed to still be there. But the shadow around Paul was instantly dispersed. Before Paul could even realize what was happening, an extremely cold wind suddenly blew in front of him. Paul's heart sank and he quickly retreated. But the next second, a silver mask appeared in front of him. How could it be so fast? The thought turned in his mind for a moment. He clenched Ghost Hand and slashed at it directly. 3 black shadows wrapped in light appeared around Paul at the same time. The scarlet saber light of Ghost Hand split Tribulation's body, but what it hit was only a shadow. Shadow formula. Switching positions. Tribulation, who had changed positions with the shadow, was getting closer to Paul. The 3 shadows and Tribulation himself had made the light continuous. A lot of light shone on Paul, and Paul's figure became clearer than ever. Forbid! A low voice sounded in the night sky. The light, the shadow, and the night sky twisted wildly at the same time. Paul's figure froze for a moment. The next second, Tribulation's hands had begun to make a seal. Slaughter! The three dark shadows copied Tribulation's movements at the same time. Crazy power surged from all directions, with Tribulation as the center. The nearby twisted space seemed to be completely pulled by Tribulation's handprint. The absolute power was violent and chaotic, roaring as it was pulled by Tribulation and smashed toward Paul. The constantly shaking space was completely out of control. Paul's face changed dramatically in an instant. "You lunatic!" Before he finished speaking, a large piece of space, which was constantly twisting and exploding, had directly shrouded him. It enveloped Paul. At the same time, it also enveloped Tribulation. Tribulation's eyes grew colder and colder. He was the strongest assassin in the dark world, so he knew very well how much damage a person like Paul could cause in a stalemate. After tonight, Li Tianlan and Rothschild were mortal enemies. Under such circumstances, Tribulation didn't want to let go of any accident, nor would he give him the slightest chance to break out of the encirclement. The whole situation had begun to collapse gradually. The addition of the two invincible realm experts, Violet and Hastile, had given Paul the power to fight back. Together with King Tong, Paul already had 4 invincible realm experts on his side. Arcis of the Vatican hadn't arrived yet. The situation was dragging on. It was not even a question of whether Rothschild would break out of the encirclement, but whether Paul would reverse the whole situation and turn defeat into victory. An assassin-type expert who was infinitely close to the peak of the invincible realm could create any miracle in such a scene. Therefore, Tribulation's actions were extremely intense. He didn't hold back at all. As soon as he got close to Paul, he had already twisted the space within hundreds of meters around him. In the Buddhist incantation of 9 words, the shadow formula was the fastest, the stop formula was similar to the domain, and the slaughter formula was a strong attack. The space within hundreds of meters was constantly twisting and exploding. Tribulation's hands were still making gestures. Destroy! Boom! The whole night sky completely exploded. Countless streams of light flew wildly, looking extremely gorgeous. Tribulation's invincible realm was not stable. The breakthrough back then was too intense. Until today, his injuries had not recovered. Therefore, he was no match for Paul, and he didn't expect to be able to kill Paul. But his heart was far colder than Paul's. This was the real assassin's heart. Paul's fighting style was that of an assassin, but he didn't have the mentality of an assassin, so he was just the patriarch of Rothschild. Tribulation, on the other hand, was a real assassin. He went all out to twist the void within hundreds of meters around him. Under the confinement of the stop formula, the space that was completely out of control kept exploding, covering Paul and himself. In this completely out of control range, the huge power could destroy everything, hurt Paul, and also hurt Tribulation himself. This was completely a way of dying together. Determined, ruthless, and relentless. Cass Rotter suddenly opened his hands. A thunderbolt, which was already so dense that it was almost tangible, was constantly condensing in his hands. Cass Rotter's eyes were fierce and crazy. A large area of the void began to flash with thunderbolts. All the thunderbolts were condensed in his hands. A thunderball emitting a faint blue light had condensed between Cass Rotter's hands. At this moment, no one hesitated. Everyone understood what tribulation meant. The Lord of Shadow in the dark world completely locked on Paul regardless of his own safety. The void kept exploding around the two of them. As strong as Paul was, it was impossible for him to completely get rid of this completely out of control domain in a short time. For all the invincible realm experts, this was the best opportunity. The thunderbolts in Cass Rotter's hands shone with an incomparably dazzling light. His open hands suddenly began to close, and he placed them on the thunderbolt ball. A huge force surged between his arms, squeezing the lightning orb. Boom! In the deep night sky, there was a sudden sound of thunder that was enough to shock the whole city. The ball that had condensed infinite thunderbolts completely exploded. Thousands of thunderbolts covered the sky and kept falling toward the domain where Tribulation and Paul were. Thunder God strike. This strike completely ignored the enemy and himself. It enveloped Paul and Tribulation at the same time. The black saber light converged with the awe-inspiring sword intent in the thunderbolts all over the sky. Raphael and Xianxia were already standing together. The saber light and the sword energy roared wildly. In the out-of-control domain, thunderbolts fell down, and the cold saber light and sword energy flew around like rain. Tribulation seemed to have lost his mind. Countless saber light and sword energy pierced through his body. In the dripping blood, he chased after Paul like crazy. Every time Paul flashed, he was completely locked on by him. The two figures were constantly entangled in the killing intent all over the sky. More and more blood was on Tribulation's body, but his eyes were getting colder and colder. "Brother!" King Tong, who was on the ground, desperately condensed her domain, and a large number of shadows flew like a tide. The night sky in the distance was shaking at the same time. The blazing white light of heaven gathered crazily, but a strange domain imprisoned the light of heaven. In that domain, heaven and earth seemed to have lost gravity. Countless rays of light floated blankly in the domain, constantly gathering and more. Heaven and earth were useless. Sidutongyue, the city governor of Sai City, stood in front of Patriarch Hostile and kept him there. Before the war broke out, she had texted Li Tianlan that she was in Reki City. It wasn't until now that she finally appeared. Everyone was fighting with all their might. The saber light, thunderbolts, and sword energy kept circling around. Paul couldn't get rid of Tribulation's desperate entanglement. Tribulation's injury was getting worse. But Paul's body was also stained with blood. His realm was not as good as Paul's. But he dared to die. To die! This was something that most invincible realm experts were unwilling to accept. But Tribulation did it in such an ordinary and resolute way. Violet on the ground finally stopped slaughtering the elites of the major forces. He rushed to the sky with the saber. Mellad finally got the chance. His voice shook the sky and said, "Purification." The pure light on his body soared in an instant. In an instant, light also appeared in the team of the Vatican on the ground. The light gathered on the ground and in the sky. Melad's figure became extremely majestic in an instant. Buzz! The whole world suddenly buzzed for a moment. A force like a mountain and a sea rose from the ground and whizzed forward with an incomparably fierce momentum. Invincible strike. Another invincible realm expert rushed in at the most critical moment. The huge power gathered into a huge shadow of a fist. The shadow rushed up. This was not a reinforcement. It was Morton. Mellad flew into a rage. But the shadow of the fist swept across the sky. In an instant, it directly hit Raphael and Xianxia. The light on Melad's body suddenly turned, and he was about to block the punch. But a ray of light suddenly appeared in his sight. It was a red light. It was like light, extremely weak. On the ground, a few lonely figures appeared in the chaotic crowd. Their eyes were a little blank and cold. However, a faint red light shot out from their eyes, bringing with it an unparalleled danger. Mellad suddenly thought of what His Majesty had told him before. A person whose eyes could glow red? His movements suddenly stiffened for a moment. In the blink of an eye, the punch that went up against the sky appeared directly behind Xianxia without Melad's obstruction. Bang! The loud sound was extremely dull. Xianxia's body shook violently, and a large amount of blood mist burst out from all over his body. Chapter 506. This sudden punch could be said to have completely overturned the current situation. At the most anxious time, both Raphael and Xianxia had no time to care about other things. The full blow of an invincible realm expert went up against the sky. Mellad, who could have stopped it, hesitated for a moment. So in the blink of an eye, the huge fist shadow condensed with infinite power had already reached the back of Xianxia and Raphael. The edge was broken by Paul. Xianxia, whose sword energy was already a little weak, directly made the coldest and most rational choice. Even in his heyday, his strength was not as good as Raphael's, let alone in his current weak state. So in the face of this punch, he directly stood behind Raphael and used his body to face the fist shadow. This was not only for Raphael or Li Tianlan. Most importantly, it was for tonight. Li Tianlan and the Snowdance Corps were not the only ones who had a grudge against Rothschild tonight. Qin Shilai was the first invincible realm expert to make a move in this mess. If tonight's plan failed, when Rothschild recovered, Li Tianlan would not be able to bear the revenge of Paul and King Tong, and neither would the Qin clan in Eastern Europe. So tonight they had to win. If they won, they would survive. If they lost, they would die. The punch, which was surging with endless power, completely fell on Qin Shilai's body, and the huge destructive power completely enveloped Qin Shilai. His body seemed to be blank. Qin Shilai was a little confused. In an instant, it seemed that all the warmth in his body rushed out with that blank space. There was a transparent bloody hole in his abdomen. Blood flowed out of the bloody hole and burst out from every part of his body. His body was completely out of control and he fell from the sky. No one knew whether Qin Shilai was alive or dead. But with such a serious injury, even if Qin Shilai was lucky to survive, it meant that the Dark Sword Master was destined to withdraw from the battlefield tonight, and even from the Dark World forever. Some people quit and some joined. As Qin Shilai's figure fell from the sky, another figure directly approached the air where Qin Shilai had been. The domain formed entirely by power was undulating and whistling around him. He clenched his hand and, without hesitation, punched Raphael again. In the surging domain of power, his figure was extremely strong and burly. Vaguely, people could see a dignified and serious face. Lagos Morton. He was the current patriarch of the Morton family, one of the 4 great families in Eastern Europe. He was an expert second only to Qin Shilai on the Holy List. Li Tianlan used the Snowdance Corps to imprison Rothschild's strongest ally, Wang Tianzong. But in the war of breaking out and fighting, Rothschild's trump cards in Eastern Europe were revealed one after another. Violet joined the fray. Patriarch Lawrence joined the battle. Lagos Morton joined the fray. Rothschild now had 5 invincible realm experts. As enemies, Mitchell died, Huan Kong died, and Qin Shilai withdrew from the battle. The 2 invincible realm experts of Rothschild completely turned the situation around in a desperate situation, and the real allies came. Get lost. Raphael, who had been saved by Qin Shilai, completely reacted. In the domain that had gone out of control ahead, the seriously injured Tribulation and Paul were still fighting crazily. The jet black saber light fell into the domain. The fist shadows behind him roared and surged forward with boundless power. Raphael's eyes were bloodshot. He held the Dark Saint's spear tightly and slashed at Lagos with a backhand slash. The ultimate technique of the Knights of Darkness instantly shattered the sky. Raphael was no longer in his peak state. But the suppression of an expert on the Divine List over an expert on the Holy List was still the most thorough. God Killer. The jet black saber light was cold and treacherous. The saber light condensed and went crazy. In an instant, it appeared in front of Lagos's domain. One strike. With just one strike, the domain of power around Lagos collapsed. The fallen. Raphael's whole body had been completely surrounded by the thick darkness. The night was constantly twisting, surrounding everything around him and Lagos. The distorted night sky turned into giant blades with shocking murderous aura. The dark saber shadows smashed down overwhelmingly. Lagos's face suddenly changed. His body curled up for a moment, and then he stretched out with all his might, turned around and ran away. Dark wanted. All the darkness around Raphael completely turned into a domain. The domain had a radius of hundreds of meters, but it kept shrinking and became extremely sticky in an instant. Lagos's figure became slower and slower in the domain of the Dark Wanted, and the saber shadows carried by the fallen had already smashed down like a rainstorm. How dare you! A crazed scream suddenly rang out. The crazy saber light lit up around the domain of the Dark Wanted in an instant. The saber light was violent and ferocious. Violet's figure appeared around the domain. The saber light burst out in an instant as she waved her saber. Lagos didn't hesitate to unleash his domain. Inside and outside the domain of the Death Wanted, the 2 experts on the Holy List attacked with all their might at the same time. Raphael's domain almost exploded in an instant. Raphael's expression was still cold. His figure flashed forward and appeared directly between Violet and Lagos. The dark saint spear was pointed at the sky. Raphael's face was pale and cold. The ultimate move. Dark Gospel. Boom! A large amount of black saber light filled with the aura of death burst out from the dark saint's spear and directly enveloped Lagos and Violet. The crazy battle reached its climax in the blink of an eye. Tribulation was still entangled with Paul. All the attacks of Cass Rotter and Mellad were merging with the domain that was out of control. The dark gospel brought with it a thick black fog of death. The fog kept condensing. Lagos and Violet were entangled with Raphael. In the distant sky, the domain of the useless heaven and earth imprisoned a large amount of the light of heaven. The whole night sky was constantly distorted under the white light. Situ Tsangyue was still entangled with Patriarch Hostile. The shadow domain that filled the night sky began to shrink slowly. On the ground, King Tong's golden pupils suddenly became extremely cold. The shadow domain shrank for a moment. Paul's momentum dropped in an instant. The pressure on tribulation lightened. But because of the absence of Raphael, even if Paul lost the domain of King Tong, the several invincible realm experts around him still couldn't pose a fatal threat to him. The shadow faded in just a few seconds. But a huge and cold sense of danger rose directly from the ground. The next second, the shadow spread again. King Tong's figure directly approached the sky. Without any hesitation, the shadow shrouded Paul's figure, and King Tong rushed directly to Mellad. The shadow and the light collided and fought. Blood splattered everywhere. An earth-shattering bang rang out, and the next second, it was continuous. Outside the out-of-control domain, there was no Raphael, no Mellad, and Tribulation who had been seriously injured. With only Cass Rotter left, Paul did not hesitate to attack with all his might. He directly smashed the domain that was completely out of control with one saber strike. Almost at the same time, the useless heaven and earth could no longer imprison more and more light of heaven. The light and the domain completely exploded after reaching the limit. Lagos and Violet also suffered serious injuries and forcibly broke through Raphael's domain. On the three battlefields, 3 explosions rang out almost at the same time. The incomparably great power rushed to the surface of the earth like the end of the world. Paul, King Tong, Violet, Lagos, Lawrence, Raphael, Tsangyue, Cass Rotter, Tribulation, and Mellad. The battlefield of the 10 invincible realm experts ushered in the strongest collision. The strongest outburst of the 10 invincible realm experts rushed to the ground at the same time, like a hurricane that suddenly rose in the void. The violent and incredible power almost tore the earth apart in an instant. The hard ground, the tall buildings, and everything in the block completely collapsed under the violent power. The entire Reki city seemed to shake violently, and the wide block had been razed to the ground in an instant. Tribulation was covered in blood. His figure stood in the air, as if he wanted to do something. But the next moment, his figure shook violently and fell directly from the sky. Paul, who was also covered in blood, looked a little pale. He reached out his hand and slowly wiped the blood from the corner of his mouth. He looked at Cass Rotter and then at the others. The current patriarch of Rothschild, who was so powerful that he almost subverted everyone's cognition, finally laughed. "You lost." His tone was calm and confident. Although Paul was injured, his combat capability was still there. He had survived all the way from the desperate situation to the present. There were now 5 invincible realm experts on their side. And the other side had fallen to the ground with tribulation. Now there were only 4 invincible realm experts. The key was that no one could control Paul's strength. Melad's heart kept sinking. He glanced around again. Arsis still didn't come over. At this time, it was enough for Arsis to go back and forth from the battlefield to the church twice. But Arsis hadn't appeared yet. This could only mean one thing. It wasn't that Arsis didn't want to come, but he couldn't come for the time being. Why was this happening? They lost. With such a huge advantage, did they really lose? "Are you so confident?" A voice suddenly rang out. Cass Rotter looked at Paul, and his voice was cold. Paul glanced at him and suddenly laughed. His voice was cold and gloomy. "You're the next one to die." Obviously, he had changed his strategy. In the situation where his side was at a disadvantage, his strategy was to kill the weakest invincible realm expert on the other side as soon as possible. The death of the two invincible realm experts, Mitchell and Huan Kong, was enough to prove the success of his strategy, and it was also the key to his survival until now. Now, Rothschild had a big enough advantage. Paul changed his strategy. He actually wanted to kill the strongest Cass Rotter and completely settle the battle. A crazy roar suddenly rang out. The sounds of slaughter and screams came from all directions. The elites of Rothschild, the Eastern Church, Morton, and the Violet family finally appeared on the battlefield, crazily attacking the formation of the army of Wulan State. Cass Rotter's expression was still calm. He replied to Paul with exactly the same words, confident and calm. "You're the next one to die." "What makes you think so?" Paul asked with narrowed eyes. Cass Rotter didn't say anything. However, a crimson light suddenly shone in front of him. The light kept condensing in front of him, with unparalleled spirituality and extremely fierce danger. In an instant, Paul's whole body was completely locked by an extremely cold and destructive force. Cass Rotter picked up a necklace around his neck. The necklace was small and quaint, looking like a cross. But all the red light was emitted from the cross, and the small cross was changing shape, growing larger and longer. Cass Rotter held the cross, his face grave and solemn. The constantly changing necklace finally turned into an exaggeratedly big gun. It was called a gun, but the muzzle was as big as the muzzle of a cannon. Countless rays of red light were constantly condensing in the muzzle, which looked extremely strange. Cass Rotter pointed the gun at Paul and said calmly, "That's it." Paul stopped laughing. His eyes were fixed on the gun in Cass Rotter's hand. "Holy punishment of void," he said word by word. Holy punishment of void, one of the 12 murderous weapons in the Dark World, was also the only murderous weapon in North America. The red light kept converging. Cass Rotter put his finger on the trigger. Looking at Paul, who was so close that he could not avoid it, he said calmly, "Goodbye." Paul tightened his body and pulled King Tong back quickly without hesitation. Cass Rotter smiled and slowly exerted force with his fingers. Suddenly, another hand appeared on the barrel of the void godly punishment. The extremely hard palm directly blocked the muzzle of the holy punishment of void. Cass Rotter's pupils suddenly shrank. An extremely strange figure suddenly appeared in front of him. The other party was also emitting scarlet light, which almost merged with the light of the holy punishment of void. Cass Rotter was a little confused, but the other party's movements were extremely firm. He let go of his palm and blocked the chest of the holy punishment of void with his body. He held Cass Rotter's body with a pair of hands. Cass Rotter struggled with all his might, but he couldn't get rid of the other party's imprisonment at all. The unimaginable power completely fixed his figure in the void. Cass Rotter's eyes instantly became extremely frightened. In his sight, an expressionless face suddenly became extremely clear. In the red light all over the sky, the other party said calmly, "Die." His body directly crashed into Cass Rotter, and one of his hands directly pressed against Cass Rotter's palm. Boom! The red light all over the sky suddenly exploded. In the chaos of Eastern Europe, for the first time, a murderous weapon opened fire directly. Countless rays of death exploded in the nearest distance and completely enveloped Cass Rotter. Suddenly, there was a rain of blood in the air. The red light was still spreading and entangling in the air. Vaguely, an object emitting red light fell down and landed in the rain on the ground. A figure walked over and bent down to pick up the object that had fallen into the water. It was an eyeball. The eyeball had not been opened, so the light in the pupil was extremely weak. The figure held the eyeball and looked at it silently for a while. In the rain of blood all over the sky, he opened his mouth and directly ate the eyeball. Chapter 507. For everyone in the Dark World, the night of August 17th was destined to be extremely long. The constantly changing situation affected everyone's heart. In the office of the president, the chaos of the situation even diluted Li Tianlan's surprise at Qin Weibai's sudden arrival. Li Tianlan's expression was still calm. But his heart kept falling with the changing situation, as if he had fallen from heaven to hell, from summer to winter. The screen in front of him was filled with red light. The murderous weapon in North America, the holy punishment of void, had been silent for a long time. This time, Cass Rotter fired with all his might, and its lethality could be said to be at its peak. The whole night sky was completely dyed red. The heavy rain in the night was still raging, but the dark night seemed to suddenly have countless burning clouds. The incomparably gorgeous colors burned the whole sky. The red clouds kept fluttering, and the void was burned, twisted, and hollow. Li Tianlan watched this scene quietly and remained silent for a long time. At this moment, in different parts of the world, countless people were silent. The holy punishment of void did not take a long time to accumulate energy, but it was longer than the murderous weapon-setting sun of Zhongzhou State. So of course, its power was also stronger than setting Sunday. And Cass Rotter's real strength, strictly speaking, was not even as good as Gu Xingyun. It was self-evident what this meant. Everything that had happened just now was too weird. Cass Rotter took out the holy punishment of void and aimed it at Paul. A figure burning with red light could actually ignore the domain formed before the holy punishment of void was fired and directly appeared in front of Cass Rotter. This was weird enough. But what was even more incomprehensible was that the moment the other party appeared in front of Cass Rotter was completely controlled by the other party without any ability to resist. So Cass Rotter detonated the murderous weapon. In front of him, this shot could even be said to have been fired at himself. Why did this happen? The only reasonable explanation was that the other party was stronger than Cass Rotter. The person who could control Cass Rotter the moment he got close to him should at least be a top expert at the peak of the invincible realm, such as Deity, Lin Fengting, or Arceus. Such an expert had the strength to sweep the whole field. If he was properly prepared, he could also resist a blow from the murderous weapon. The other party had no reason to die with Cass Rotter. But if that person was not at the peak of the invincible realm, how did he control Cass Rotter? Li Tianlan's mind went blank. The red clouds that filled the sky continued to rise, bearing the truth and evaporating everything. At this moment, Li Tianlan suddenly didn't want to think about anything. He did not understand how the other party had controlled Cass Rotter. But that was no longer important. Most importantly, at such a close distance, the energy of the godly punishment of the void was pouring out in torrents. There was no longer any possibility of Cass Rotter surviving. The god of war of Star State eventually died in Eastern Europe. From earlier, Jiang Chenyan, Black Ghost, Chaos, to tonight's Mitchell, Huan Kong, and now Cass Rotter. The chaos in Eastern Europe had torn apart the lives of 6 invincible realm experts. In addition to Qin Shilai, whose life or death was unknown for the time being, there might be 7 of them. How many invincible realm experts were there in the world? But the general trend in Eastern Europe was still surging with the wind and rain, and a torrent seemed to never stop. Li Tianlan looked at the screen in front of him, but his eyes seemed to lose focus. The red glow on the screen began to dissipate. The light disappeared, and the distorted space gradually calmed down. The heavy rain fell, and it was as if nothing had happened. It seemed that something had fallen from the sky. The murderous weapon had disappeared from the place where the godly punishment of the void had just been fired. Cass Rotter had also disappeared. It was as if he had never existed. Li Tianlan narrowed his eyes tightly. The power in the field had been presented in the most obvious manner. Paul, Qingtong, Violet, Lagos, and Hastile. Raphael, Siditang and Mellad. 8 invincible realm experts. Strictly speaking, Mellad was just Li Tianlan's partner. The Vatican could change its position at any time. So strictly speaking, only Siditang and Raphael were on Li Tianlan's side at this time. Li Tianlan could not hear Paul's words. But he knew that he had lost. From the very beginning, he had the upper hand. But now, the situation had taken a sharp turn for the worse. Everything that Li Tianlan had done tonight could be said to be a real failure. And the most fatal loophole in all this was that their side had seriously underestimated Paul's strength. After joining hands with King Tong, Paul could be said to be a real expert at the peak of the invincible realm. He alone had stalled several invincible realm experts for too long, which directly overturned everything that Li Tianlan had carefully prepared. He turned the situation around with his own strength. This was the peak of the invincible realm. Li Tianlan took a deep breath. All the unwillingness in his heart seemed to turn into a flame in his body. His whole body seemed to be on fire, but his expression was terrifyingly calm. "It's my mistake," Qin Weibai, who had been sitting next to Li Tianlan, suddenly said. The estimation of Paul's strength was completely provided by the Samsara Palace. According to the intelligence of the Samsara Palace, Paul's current strength should be able to enter the divine list, but it was slightly inferior to King Tong's. But the actual situation was a little wrong. With the strength that Paul had shown tonight, even 2 King Tongs were not as good as Paul. The mistake in the intelligence directly led to everything that happened tonight. Otherwise, everything would have gone smoothly tonight. "It's not your fault." Li Tianlan shook his head. Tonight's mistake seemed to be because of the intelligence of the Samsara Palace, but it also made Li Tianlan realize his own flaws. At this moment, Li Tianlan finally admitted that no matter how perfect his willpower was in martial arts, he was still a little impetuous in the general trend. It was not a mistake to trust the intelligence of the Samsara Palace. The biggest mistake was that his plan was too crazy. Crazy meant extreme rash. He went forward with indomitable will, leaving no room for leeway. Such a plan often meant that he could master everything perfectly. So when Paul's strength exceeded his expectations, the whole plan had been completely out of control. It was doomed to fail. Doomed? Li Tianlan asked himself subconsciously. Is it really doomed? The moment this question came up, he asked himself again. There's still a chance. Li Tianlan suddenly said. Of course. Qin Weibai chuckled and said softly, Tianlan, do you know Sun Tzu's Art of War? Most of the time, the more complicated and unfavorable the situation is, the more we have to deal with it in the simplest way. Tonight in Reki City, you can do whatever you want, regardless of victory or defeat. Li Tianlan didn't speak. He just glanced at the screen again. There was no room for his plan. But in fact, there was a lot of room. When Qin Shilai and Tribulation withdrew from the battlefield, and Raphael and Siducang were not in their peak state, Li Tianlan still had a trump card that he hadn't used. He himself hadn't moved yet. In today's complicated and unfavorable situation, the simplest way was for him to rush over with the elites of the Snowdance Corps. He would face Paul, King Tong, Violet, Lagos, and Hastile. The incomparably huge pressure surged over like a mountain or a sea. Li Tianlan's eyes were quiet and deep. I can't lose, he said softly. He couldn't, and he was unwilling. Everything that happened tonight should have had a very perfect ending in his plan. But if the situation continued to develop, in the case of a crushing defeat, not to mention a perfect ending, even the advantage that Li Tianlan had built in Reki City would be completely ruined. The chaos in Eastern Europe might not end tonight, but after tonight, the overall situation was bound to become clear. At this critical moment, if Li Tianlan admitted defeat and left Reki City, there would be no place for the Snowdance Corps in all of Eastern Europe. If he returned to Zhongzhou State with such a result, the future of him and the Li family would become bleak. Li Tianlan was now like a gambler who knew he would lose but couldn't afford to lose at all. His eyes were red, and he almost lost his mind and wanted to bet everything he had. Li Tianlan was looking at the screen. Qin Weibai was looking at Li Tianlan. Li Tianlan didn't move. But Qin Weibai clearly noticed that there was a kind of unwillingness in him, struggling, burning, and finally becoming crazy and hysterical. Her eyes were gentle and affectionate, but there was a trance in the depths of her eyes. It seemed that in the memory of a long, long time ago, but also as if it was yesterday, there was also a man who had amazed the whole dark world. In the face of a great dilemma, he was silent, struggling, and crazy. At that time, she was still very naive and childish. Thus, she watched as the man walked into a predicament in silence, walked into a hopeless situation, and finally buried everything he had. The memory passed through the quiet years and was shrouded in light. Li Tianlan's figure seemed to be merging with the memory, and they were inseparable. Qin Weibai suddenly laughed. She reached out and put her palm in Li Tianlan's hand. "Nothing is perfect," she said softly, "but there is nothing that can't be made up for. Tianlan, you won't lose." Her voice was gentle and firm. Today, tonight. She was Qin Weibai, Li Tianlan's woman. Now she was not naive or childish. She had the real qualification to stand by Li Tianlan's side. Li Tianlan might not be perfect now, but Qin Weibai firmly believed that standing by Li Tianlan's side was Li Tianlan's perfection. The intelligence of Samsara Palace could be wrong. She could also make mistakes. But she would not allow herself to fail. The silver bracelet on Li Tianlan's left hand lit up. The sword intent was extremely abundant, and the light on the silver bracelet shone more brightly. This sword. Qin Weibai looked at the silver light on Li Tianlan's wrist and whispered, "It's not perfect. Even if it's not perfect, I still have to use it." Li Tianlan whispered. The silver edge spread in his hand. Falling stars was the first choice in his hand. However, at this moment, some subtle cracks had appeared on the silver blade of falling stars. Li Tianlan looked at the cracks on the blade and remained silent. The spirituality is not enough, the sword energy is not strong, and the sword body is also incomplete. Since it's not perfect, then don't use it. Qin Weibai looked at Li Tianlan. There was a very obvious hesitation in her eyes, but she finally made up her mind. She said with a smile, "Tianlan, how about I give you a sword?" Li Tianlan was a little confused. What kind of sword? Of course, it's a real magic weapon that is most suitable for you and worthy of your future. Qin Weibai stared at Li Tianlan's face, and her eyes were a little sad. She turned her head and glanced at the screen. On the screen, the red light all over the sky completely dissipated. It was late at night. Qin Weibai suddenly asked, "Tianlan, do you know how the people of the Devil Troop just controlled Cass Rotter?" Chapter 508. The Devil Troop. Although he had a hunch in his heart, Li Tianlan still felt a little cold when he heard Qin Weibai's words. The Devil Troop was the most mysterious force of the Wang family of Beihai. It was also the trump card that Wang Tianzong could still play in Reki City even though he was imprisoned tonight. But Li Tianlan had never known what the Devil Troop was. So in his uneasiness and anxiety, the sudden appearance of the Devil Troop gave him an absolute surprise, and then disappeared in an instant. The way the other party perished together was extremely tragic. But Cass Rotter's death also completely determined Li Tianlan's defeat tonight. This surprise was absolutely important to Li Tianlan. Li Tianlan lit a cigarette and took a deep breath. The Devil Troop. Who the hell are they? They are a group of monsters that are neither alive nor dead, Qin Weibai said softly. Their state is very special, and their bodies are even more special, so they can control murderous weapons. Li Tianlan vaguely understood. He looked at Qin Weibai and asked, "Can they control murderous weapons?" The death of Cass Rotter has proved this. Qin Weibai said, "At the moment when the holy punishment of void was fired, it was not Cass Rotter who was really controlled, but the holy punishment of void. To be more precise, it was the murderous weapons that rebelled, which eventually caused Cass Rotter's death. The holy punishment of void was controlled. The murderous weapons rebelled." Li Tianlan looked at Qin Weibai as if he were listening to a fantasy story. Murderous weapons can also rebel? Dongqing Rushi came over and asked curiously. The murderous weapons themselves are a kind of living metal. They have their own intelligence, so they are extremely powerful. However, we can't understand this kind of life form for the time being, so we can only make use of their power. Qin Weibai said, "Anything with intelligence and life can betray us." "But it's not easy," Li Tianlan suddenly said. Qin Weibai nodded. "But for the Wang family of Beihai, it's not necessarily difficult. Tianlan, you should have heard that the 13 murderous weapons come from the same piece of life metal. And this piece of life metal was obtained by the ancestor of the Wang family of Beihai after he defeated a strong opponent." Li Tianlan narrowed his eyes thoughtfully. Qin Weibai's voice was a little cold. "Murderous weapons have lives. It's not easy to make murderous weapons rebel. But since they have lives, they naturally have thoughts. What if the holy punishment of the void thought that the people of the devil troop were their own kind at that moment? Li Tianlan suddenly raised his head and looked at Qin Weibai, his eyes burning. Qin Weibai's tone was calm, as if she was talking about the simplest fact. The murderous weapon can make the murderous weapon think that the other person is its own kind. Naturally, there are a few fragments of the murderous weapon in the body of every person in the devil troop. You mean, Li Tianlan's voice suddenly became unprecedentedly dry. Every member of the devil troop is a murderous weapon? In essence, every member of the devil troop was once an invincible realm expert of the Wang family of Beihai. Their bodies will age and their realms will decline, but in order to protect the Wang family of Beihai, they willingly accepted the transformation of the Wang family of Beihai. This transformation is very complicated, and the most important thing is the implantation of the murderous weapon fragments. The implantation of the murderous weapon fragments will integrate the spirituality of the fragments with their physical skills, so that their bodies will always be alive. After that, the Wang family of Beihai should take measures similar to freezing and completely seal these people. They will die. Dongchen Rushi suddenly said seriously. Qin Weibai glanced at her and nodded. The Wang family of Beihai has the immortality potion. The reason why the production of the immortality potion is rare is that several of the medicines are hard to find in the world. But the rarest materials are not for making the immortality potion. Do you understand? For example, to make a pure immortality potion, it needs about 60 kinds of precious materials, but to make a finished immortality potion, it needs 80 kinds of materials. The latter 20 kinds of materials are added to neutralize some of the side effects of the immortality potion. Without these 20 kinds of materials, it is also the immortality potion with the same massive vitality, or even more powerful, but it is also a kind of poison that can make people doomed eternally. After adding the latter 20 kinds of medicines, the immortality potion is the most precious immortality potion, because it has no side effects and can be taken by people. But for the devil troop, what they need is the simplest immortality potion, which is vitality. This kind of medicine combined with the frozen environment can keep their bodies alive for a long time. But the poison of the immortality potion will gradually make them lose all their memories. The spirituality of the murderous weapon fragments and the vitality will combine with each other and turn them into monsters that will only obey orders. They don't feel pain, and they don't even have much thinking. Their only goal is to complete the task. They used to be experts of the invincible realm in the Wang family of Beihai. Even if their martial arts have degenerated over a long time, their bodies will always be close to the peak state under the stimulation of the immortality potion. Under such circumstances, the realm they show may be the fire-flaming realm or the thunder-shocking realm, but it doesn't matter. The most important thing is that their defense, speed, and even strength are all in the invincible realm. This is the devil troop of the Wang family of Beihai. The Wang family of Beihai replaced people's souls with the spirituality of the murderous weapon fragments and the vitality of the immortality potion, turning the former experts of the invincible realm into war machines that can only fight by instinct. That's why the holy punishment of void regarded the devil troop as its own kind and betrayed Cass Rotter. Li Tianlan took a deep drag on the cigarette. The thick smoke poured into his lungs, and he suddenly coughed violently. Dongchen Rushi and Qin Weibai's delicate palms fell on Li Tianlan's back almost at the same time. Qin Weibai took a glass of water and handed it to Li Tianlan. Li Tianlan drank up the water in the quilt. After a moment of silence, he asked, "How many of such devil troop does the Wang family of Beihai have?" "I don't know the exact number. But it won't be less than 20. The oldest devil troop has even been sleeping for hundreds of years. As far as I know, the Wang family of Beihai once used the devil troop on Mount Dibbing more than 20 years ago. At that time, 12 of them were dispatched. If I'm not mistaken, the ones who came to Eastern Europe this time should also be these 12. Qin Weibai said softly, "The vitality of the immortality potion is the most effective when it is frozen. Otherwise, how can they survive for hundreds of years?" In the eyes of the Wang family of Beihai, the devil troop is the most luxurious consumable. They used it once more than 20 years ago. Even if it was frozen immediately, the damage to their vitality should be very serious. When the devils enter the human world, they won't live for long. This time, Wang Tianzong should want to use them all in Eastern Europe. Li Tianlan nodded and took a deep look at the screen. The battlefield on the screen once again became extremely chaotic. However, the situation had been completely reversed from before. Raphael and Situ Tsangyue had already met up. Mellad also approached them. Outside them, 5 invincible realm experts, Paul, King Tong, Lagos, Hostile, and Violet, were frantically besieging 3 invincible realm experts. On the ground, the elites of Rothschild finally arrived at the battlefield, followed by the elites of Morton and the Violet family. The streets were in a mess, and the war was everywhere. Li Tianlan stood up and looked at the screen. His eyes gradually became sharp. There's still a chance. Qin Weibai said softly, as long as Arcis and Charlemagne arrive at the battlefield, there is still hope to turn the situation around. I won't wait any longer. Li Tianlan suddenly said, if we wait any longer, they won't be able to hold on. Charlemagne and Arcis hadn't arrived yet, but they would definitely arrive. The situation tonight had been delayed by Paul until now. Paul would definitely know better than anyone that it would be equally disadvantageous for them to delay. Therefore, although Paul had just consumed a lot of physical strength, his attack at this time was still extremely fierce. Situ Tsangyue couldn't hold on any longer. Raphael couldn't hold on either. I'll go, Li Tianlan said, as if he was talking to himself. He nodded and repeated, well, I'll go. Dongcheng Rushi opened her mouth subconsciously. She glanced at Qin Weibai and fell silent again. Li Tianlan would definitely join this battlefield. But compared to the plan, it was much earlier and the risk was much higher. You should do what you want to do. Qin Weibai walked up to Li Tianlan, reached out to touch his face, and said softly, don't worry, you will win, as long as you are willing to do your best. Of course. Li Tianlan laughed. He directly turned off the screen in front of him. There was no point in watching it. If he couldn't make a comeback tonight, the advantage of Reki City would disappear, everything they had in Eastern Europe would not exist, and the future of the Li family would not exist either. So he couldn't afford to lose. He had to win. Li Tianlan held Qin Weibai's hand that was stroking his face, feeling the gentleness and fragrance. He took a deep breath, looked at Dongcheng Rushi again, and said calmly, wait for me to come back. He turned around and walked to the door. At the same time, he put on the communication device in the Snowdance core and said blandly, gather. In an instant, the entire office of the president was in motion. The room became extremely quiet. Dongcheng Rushi looked at Qin Weibai quietly. Qin Weibai was also looking at Dongcheng Rushi. After a long time, she seemed to have confirmed something, and her eyes became softer. Sister, should we wait for him to come back? Dongcheng Rushi suddenly asked. You have to wait. Qin Weibai whispered, I won't wait. But Dongcheng Rushi asked subconsciously. I'm going to Zhongzhou State, Qin Weibai said. Qin Weibai said, I just said that I will give Tianlan a real magic weapon, one that can match his future sword intent. Is there really such a sword? Dongcheng Rushi was a little doubtful. There were too many famous swords in the world with unparalleled sharpness, but they were dead objects after all. In Kendo, the sword energy was either sharp or ethereal, and it moved according to one's heart. Therefore, after the Invincible Realm, every Invincible Realm expert in Kendo wanted to find a famous sword that could perfectly carry his sword intent. Silence in Dongcheng Rushi's hand was one. Sharpness of the Qin clan in Eastern Europe was also one. As for the peak of the Invincible Realm in the Dark World, almost no famous sword could carry their sword intent perfectly. When they reached the peak of the Invincible Realm, they needed swords with intelligence. That was murderous weapons. Falling stars in Li Tianlan's hand could almost be regarded as the ultimate sword. In terms of sharpness, falling stars might not be sharper than famous swords like Listen to the Sea, Sharpness, and Silence. It might even be a little worse. But in terms of intelligence, Falling Stars was far better than other famous swords. But Li Tianlan's sword intent was also extremely strong. Qin Weibai said that there was a divine weapon worthy of Li Tianlan's future. Li Tianlan was destined to surpass the peak of the invincible realm in the future and become the chosen one. What kind of sword could perfectly carry the sword intent of the chosen one? Dongcheng Rushi couldn't imagine the sharpness of that sword at all. Yes. Qin Weibai said softly, in Zhongzhou State, in Lin. Dongcheng Rushi looked at Qin Weibai and was silent for a while. Then, she was a little hesitant, and there was undisguised worry in her clear eyes. What should we do here tonight? Qin Weibai looked at her and seemed to think for a moment. Then she chuckled and said, tonight, very good. What's good about it? Dongcheng Rushi thought about the situation shown on the screen just now and asked without relaxing. The current situation was extremely obvious. There were only Situ Tsangyue and Raphael on their side. Paul, on the other hand, was infinitely close to the peak of the invincible realm. Even if Arcis could really arrive in time, Charlemagne of the Heroes Club would also take action, and their side would no longer have an overwhelming advantage. At best, it could only be said that there was a chance. Dongcheng Rushi's heart moved slightly, and she asked carefully and softly, Sister, do you have any other arrangements for Reki City tonight? Qin Weibai smiled and said, everything tonight is Tianlan's plan. His plan conflicts with mine, so I changed my mind. But Tianlan's plan is not perfect. Dongcheng Rushi was silent for a while, and then said softly, there are indeed loopholes in his plan, but in terms of the general trend, it is already perfect. Don't worry about some flaws. Qin Weibai's eyes were a little dazed, as if she had seen Li Tianlan's situation. He stood in a desperate situation where he thought there was no way out, but he didn't know that there was a greater force behind him. Qin Weibai thought quietly, and her eyes were calm. She was the greatest perfection in Li Tianlan's life. But tonight, Li Tianlan's perfection was not her. That night was the trial day. But tonight had greatly deviated from the original plan. The trial was still going on. But it was no longer the trial day that belonged to her. Qin Weibai came to her senses, smiled, and said, I'm leaving. Dongcheng Rushi wanted to say something but stopped on second thought. Qin Weibai walked over, tidied Dongcheng Rushi's hair, and said softly, don't let your imagination run wild. Tianlan will be fine. You, me, Yuetong, and Tianlan, we are destined to be together. Dongcheng Rushi blushed, bit her lip, and didn't speak. Qin Weibai took a deep look at her, turned around, and left. Sister. Dongcheng Rushi's voice suddenly sounded. Qin Weibai stopped where she was and didn't look back. You came today. Dongcheng Rushi suddenly felt a little confused. Did you just pass by? If Samsara Palace really didn't have any arrangement for everything tonight, then why did Qin Weibai appear here? Qin Weibai smiled and said, I came to see Wang Tianzong. Wang Tianzong was still drinking tea and he was not sleepy at all. The water in the teapot had been changed twice, but the fragrance was still there. He held the cup and sipped, and his mind seemed to be completely immersed in his own world. Wang Tianzong was very focused in this state. It was like meditation. When Qin Weibai walked into the room, Wang Tianzong was holding the teapot and pouring water. His silhouette was reflected in her line of sight, looking incomparably lofty and lonely. The tea is good, Qin Weibai said. Wang Tianzong said yes and said, have a taste. Qin Weibai came over and sat opposite Wang Tianzong. The tea was the tea that Li Tianlan had drunk. Wang Tianzong added a small amount of special potion in it. However, this kind of potion that could distract people had no effect on her. In the spiritual field, Qin Weibai was not yet in the transcendent realm. But she was definitely the person closest to the transcendent realm. Why you here? Wang Tianzong asked. His emotions didn't fluctuate, only calmness. If Qin Weibai didn't come tonight or came a little later, maybe a lot of things would have happened now. Maybe Li Tianlan would have cooperated with him now. Maybe the pattern of Zhongzhou State and the Dark World for the next 100 years would be determined tonight. There were many maybes. Wang Tianzong felt a little regretful, but he was not angry. You're hurting him, Wang Tianzong said softly, and his tone was a little emotional. He really felt that it was a pity. Until now, he thought that it was the best choice for Li Tianlan to enter the Wang family of Beihai and Wang Yuetong to be the patriarch. Qin Weibai seemed a little confused. She looked at Wang Tianzong and suddenly asked, "Your Majesty, do you really think it's a good thing for Tianlan to join the Wang family of Beihai?" Wang Tianzong was a little silent. After a while, he said slowly, "At least for me and him, this is the best situation." Qin Weibai smiled. Her smile was a little cold, but it was still perfect and exquisite, with a kind of charm that could topple a country. "It's the best for you," she said softly. "It's not too bad for Tianlan personally. But now he is more than just him. Some things should have been abandoned long ago." Wang Tianzong looked cold and waved his hand. Qin Weibai didn't seem to want to dwell on this topic. She drank a cup of tea and said softly, "He's the best when I'm with him." When she said this, she didn't show off or be arrogant, only endless softness. Wang Tianzong glanced at her. "I came here today just to see His Majesty." Qin Weibai shook her head and answered Wang Tianzong's original question. "I don't know if I should be surprised or disappointed with His Majesty's current state." Her eyes were bright and calm, and her gaze was extremely sharp. Wang Tianzong glanced at her. His eyes were a little dignified, but at this time, there was a little more smile. The Wang family of Beihai has never let anyone down. Wang Tianzong said with a smile, "The sword of Beihai is the same. The sword of Beihai is really sharp and unparalleled." Qin Weibai replied meaningfully. Wang Tianzong's pupils shrank slightly. For a long time, he didn't speak. "I heard that the Wang family of Beihai is forging swords? His Majesty should be preparing for his own breakthrough and wants a divine weapon that can carry your sword intent, right?" Qin Weibai suddenly asked. Wang Tianzong's eyes narrowed tightly, and a trace of gloom flashed in the depths of his eyes. The Wang family of Beihai forged swords. The coldness of 9 states. This matter was the top secret of the top secrets in the Wang family of Beihai. Wang Tianzong knew it. Summer Solstice knew it. In addition, only a few sword-forging staff knew it. No one would tell this news. The question was, how did Qin Weibai know it? How is the progress of the divine weapon? Qin Weibai's tone was straightforward and calm. How is His Majesty's current state? Wang Tianzong seemed to have completely calmed down and said indifferently, "Not far away." Qin Weibai nodded and said, "I also have a sword. I want to see the peerless divine weapon of the Wang family of Beihai. Now it seems that it is not the right time." "Don't worry." Wang Tianzong laughed. "You know the coldness of 9 states, but you are still so confident. So, I also want to see how your so-called divine weapon is. In the chaos of Eastern Europe, you will see me and the coldness of 9 states." "The coldness of 9 states," Qin Weibai said to herself in a somewhat complicated tone. She slowly put down the teacup and said calmly, "In this case, I will wait for the Wang family of Beihai to shine the brightest in hundreds of years." She stood up. After a few words, she had already planned to leave. Wang Tianzong looked at her back with some surprise. "So soon?" Qin Weibai's figure paused. She turned to look at Wang Tianzong and said calmly, "As I said, I came here tonight to see you. As long as you can't break through tonight, I can temporarily leave Eastern Europe with peace of mind. At present, it seems that you have no possibility of breaking through tonight, so you can't get involved in what happens outside the Caesar Hotel." "Oh," Wang Tianzong said. He looked up at his watch. Now, he looked at Qin Weibai seriously. "I don't think the battle in front of the Caesar Hotel is optimistic, right? Rothschild may be passive at first, but now, how many of your allies have died?" Mitchell, Chaos, Rotter. Qin Weibai told the truth. Tribulation and Qin Shilai have withdrawn from the battlefield. 5 people are missing. Wang Tianzong nodded. "When will Samsara Palace take action?" "Of course, when you break through." Qin Weibai answered without hesitation. "So, the master of Samsara Palace is really not dead?" Wang Tianzong thought of some rumors, narrowed his eyes, and hid all his emotions. Qin Weibai did not speak. Not speaking was a tacit agreement. "It doesn't matter." Wang Tianzong was silent for a while and said blandly, "After tonight, the general trend will be changed. Tianlan is destined to ruin his advantage in Reki City tonight. I'm here now, but I won't wait until dawn. I will become the master here." "The master here?" Qin Weibai couldn't help laughing. "Your Majesty, do you think Tianlan will lose? The situation is already obvious." Wang Tianzong asked, "How can he win?" "Indeed, the situation is already obvious." Qin Weibai nodded. "But I have a question. You know Rothschild's allies, their lineup and Paul's strength. Naturally, you have also expected the scene in front of the Caesar Hotel. In this case, why did you show your bottom line to Tianlan before? Why did you want to protect Paul and King Tong?" The muscles at the corners of Wang Tianzong's eyes twitched, and he suddenly fell silent. "Your Majesty, the situation is so obvious. Tell me, how can Tianlan lose?" Qin Weibai was aggressive. "You know everything that happened tonight. Even the current scene is meaningless. From the moment you were placed under house arrest here, Tianlan had already won. Several allies died, and 2 invincible realm experts withdrew from the battlefield. Even if Raphael and Situ Tsangyue all died here, even if the entire Snowdance Corps was wiped out, as long as Tianlan was still here, he would not lose." Qin Weibai looked at Wang Tianzong. "You know this better than anyone else. As long as you don't make a breakthrough, Tianlan is truly invincible in Reki City tonight. Lose? Do you think it's possible?" Wang Tianzong was still silent. His silence was also a tacit agreement. If he didn't make a move tonight, Li Tianlan would be invincible in the world. Very few people know this. But this was the truth. Perhaps Li Tianlan himself didn't know that his current disadvantage was meaningless to Rothschild. As Qin Weibai said, even if the entire Snowdance Corps was wiped out, even if all the invincible realm experts on his side withdrew from the battlefield, even if all the invincible realm experts standing beside him rebelled, as long as he was still there, he could use the most powerful means to save all this. Wang Tianzong knew this. That was why he showed his bottom line in advance. "Tonight, do you want to go to war with the whole Dark World?" Wang Tianzong suddenly asked. "In my plan, there should be some time before this night. That is the real trial day. Everyone is guilty. I will use all my strength to judge the whole Dark World." Qin Weibai said calmly, but Tianlan started his plan first. "I can only take a step back. His plan may not be mature enough, but it doesn't matter. A plan with a 100% success rate doesn't need the so-called maturity and correction. So tonight's trial day is the trial of the Li family. Your Majesty, you are imprisoned here. I should congratulate you for escaping. Although it's only temporary." The meaning of this sentence couldn't be more obvious. If Li Tianlan hadn't planned the war in front of the Caesar Hotel tonight, as time went by, if the real trial day was planned by Qin Weibai, even Wang Tianzong was bound to die. Wang Tianzong shook his head with a smile. "You are very confident. It's just a fact." Qin Weibai said blandly, "After tonight, the chaos in Eastern Europe can basically end, but I am still looking forward to the final ending. I am looking forward to your Majesty's breakthrough and the sharpness of the coldness of 9 states. Tianlan will make the most complicated situation simple. In the last and simplest situation, I will personally end the glory of the Wang family of Beihai." After the trial, it was not the end. Wang Tianzong would not be willing to end it. When the trial was over, there must be an end. Wang Tianzong stopped talking and turned around again. Qin Weibai continued to move forward. She opened the door and walked out. A slight but pervasive sword intent suddenly rose in the room. The sword intent tore the window lattice in front of Wang Tianzong. The wind and rain poured in, and it was a little cold. Wang Tianzong held the teacup and looked out of the window quietly. Heaven and earth were long. The night rain was boundless. His eyes were deep and cold, and eventually became the most complete silence. Chapter 509. The night in Snow City was even colder than that in Reki City. This was an area shrouded in the polar night. When the polar night fell, it was night 24 hours a day in Snow City. There was no wind or rain in Snow City at night. The lights were bright and it looked extremely quiet. In the northernmost part of Snow City, in the area connected to the mountains, there was a huge manor with a vast area, which was almost equivalent to 2 or 3 blocks. The huge and almost vast manor contained the tranquility of the nearby mountains and rivers and the prosperity of the streets, which was extraordinary. Countless lights were lit up in the manor, almost illuminating the whole manor as if it was daytime. This was Snow City, and it could even be said to be the most prominent place in the vast territory of the northeast of Snow Country. No matter from which angle, this manor, which was so huge that it seemed to be able to swallow the whole Snow City, could bring a very heavy sense of oppression to people. It was a kind of coldness and nobleness that was built up with countless wealth and power. It was an irresistible pressure. There were figures everywhere in the brightly lit manor. Countless heavily armed elites occupied various advantageous formations, almost surrounding the manor like an iron bucket. A very subtle and uneasy aura spread out from the manor, quietly echoing in the whole Snow City. The mountains in the distance were hidden in the night, faintly visible. On a low peak not far from the manor, 2 pairs of eyes were looking down at the incomparably huge and bright manor. The night was dark, and the white clothes were whiter than snow. A man and a woman, both in white robes, looked mysterious and ethereal. The night wind blew through the mountains, and the white robes carried a large amount of sword intent. The sword intent spread out, and the cold sword energy whistled in the mountains with the wind, looking awe-inspiring. Amidst the mournful howling of the wind, a melodious bell suddenly rang out. The man in white took out his mobile phone and glanced at it. The faint light of the mobile phone shone on his face. The man's face was a little pale, but every line on his face was extremely sharp. This was undoubtedly a very attractive man. Even though he was no longer young, he still had a kind of almost flamboyant handsomeness, looking very aggressive. He quietly glanced at the text message on the mobile phone screen and frowned slightly. "We're late." He suddenly spoke in a low voice, but it was extremely pleasant to the ear. A woman in white stood beside him, looking down at the PD in her hands. The image on the computer was constantly rotating at a very fast speed. As the image rotated, it would occasionally flash a corner of the manor in the distance. At this moment, there seemed to be someone hiding in the huge manor in the distance and moving quickly. The woman's eyes were cold and serious. Her appearance was not beautiful, but her clear eyes looked extremely attractive. The wind with sword intent blew her hair. She casually tidied up her hair and said seriously, "Han Chongyang and Yun Qinshi didn't fight either." The woman's voice paused for a moment before she continued, "The other party is fast." The man narrowed his eyes and remained silent. "As long as His Highness can hold on, it doesn't matter if it's faster or slower here." The woman continued. The man smiled bitterly and shook his head. "I'm afraid that His Highness can't hold on." The current situation, he thought about the contents of the message and looked at the manor in the distance, not saying a word for a long time. The defense of the entire manor was becoming more and more complete. The man's eyes fell on the tall gate of the manor, which was almost as tall as the city gate. The precious alloy gate was shining with a cold metallic brilliance. On the silver door panel, a huge purple flower was carved on it, which looked strange and gorgeous. Violet. Snow City in the northeast of Snow Country in Eastern Europe was the headquarters of the Violet family. At this time, the man and woman standing on the low peak had been lurking in Snow City for half a month, just for this night. The man seemed a little cold and sharp, and his eyes narrowed tightly. The sword energy flew, and his whole person looked more and more fierce. After the restart, the Snowdance Corps had many experts, including Cool Breeze and Drifting Cloud, Yin and Yang Phantom, and even Fireman, a top expert of the older generation of the half-step invincible realm. The lineup was strong, and there were many experts. But only a small number of people standing at the peak in Zhongzhou State knew that the strongest person in the Snowdance Corps today, apart from Li Tianlan, was not Fireman, the assassin from Sai City, or the swordsman from Mount Shu, but he, who was standing on the low peak at this moment, had never appeared in the Snowdance Corps since the outbreak of the war. Su Chang'e, the sword justice of Jade Pool in Zhongzhou State. He was the junior brother of Dongqing Wudi, the executive minister of the army headquarters of Zhongzhou State, the master of Dongqing Rushi, and the recognized #1 expert in Jade Pool. Su Chang'e held the famous sword of Jade Pool, blowing snow. His sword energy was even stronger than that of the current leader of Jade Pool and first elder Ling Shuangxue. Su Chang'e entered Jade Pool at the age of 15 and was 46 years old this year. For more than 30 years, he had hardly left Jade Pool. He was the most low-key expert in Jade Pool and had never appeared on any list in Zhongzhou State. This time, he came to Eastern Europe for the sake of his senior brother and disciple. However, to everyone's surprise, although Su Chang'e and Ling Shuangxue came to Eastern Europe, there was no news from them, as if they had disappeared out of thin air. Zhongzhou State had felt uneasy about this and had asked Li Tianlan. But Li Tianlan did not explain. Until now, people in Zhongzhou State and even in the Dark World did not know that the Sword Justice and First Elder of Jade Pool had been lingering near the headquarters of the Violet family. After more than 10 days and several careful investigations, the two finally figured out the internal situation of the Violet family. Tonight, Reki City ushered in the trial day. The Violet family, which dominated Snow Country and could cover the sky with one hand, was bound to be destroyed with the departure of the invincible realm expert Violet. Su Chang'e remained motionless. The long sword named Blowing Snow kept buzzing behind him. The sword energy rose into the sky and kept whistling like a mad dragon. Ling Shuangxue stood beside him and quietly looked at the picture on the handheld computer. Tonight, Eastern Europe was bound to be turned upside down. They were near the Violet Manor at this time. At the same time, other high-level members of the Snowdance group must have arrived around the Morton family. And if everything went well, the two assassins of Sai City should have been flying in all the countries of Eastern Europe at this time. Li Tianlan knew about the cooperation between Morton, Violet, and the Eastern Church with Rothschild. For him, this was the best opportunity. The war broke out in front of the Caesar Hotel. Violet, Lagos, and the three invincible realm experts of the Eastern Church immediately led the elites of their respective families and forces to Reki City. For them, Reki City was their best chance. But with their departure, the headquarters of the Eastern Church, the Violet family, and the Morton family all became empty as never before. Several invincible realm experts might realize this, but no one would care about it. After all the superpowers in the Dark World were gathered in Reki City at this time. Who had the time to pay attention to other places? As for Li Tianlan, perhaps they would never have thought that Li Tianlan would be so crazy. When the three invincible realm experts set off for Reki City, Li Tianlan also sent all the experts of the Snowdance Corps and led a small number of elites of the Snowdance Corps directly to their nest. Tonight, Li Tianlan did not leave any strength or leeway for himself. This was a completely hysterical and desperate attempt. If the high-level members of the Snowdance Corps stayed in Reki City, there might be a possibility of saving everything tonight, but it was just a possibility. Li Tianlan did not like possibilities. Victory was victory, and defeat was defeat. Even if Li Tianlan was defeated tonight and died in Reki City, the Eastern Church, the Violet family and the Morton family would also be buried with him. Li Tianlan was not 100% sure whether he would win or not. But he was 100% sure that his opponent would not win. It seemed that since the Li family first appeared in Zhongzhou State hundreds of years ago, there had been an extremely crazy factor flowing in the blood of the Li family. This factor was called paranoia. The picture on the handheld computer finally paused. Ling Shuangxue, who had been silent most of the time, suddenly narrowed her eyes. The picture began to freeze. Then, a voice sounded in the ears of Ling Shuangxue and Su Chang'e at the same time. In position. Ling Shuangxue took a deep breath and turned to look at her senior brother, who was also her husband. Her eyes were clear, and the sword intent was soaring. Tonight, they were carrying out the most difficult task, but they also brought the strongest elites. The intelligence system of the Samsara Palace was pervasive. But they didn't know much about the Violet family, which almost controlled the entire Snow Country. After an intelligence agent in the Samsara Palace, who had been close to the core of the Violet family, was killed in Northern Europe a few years ago, the Samsara Palace had less and less influence on the Violet family. Recently, several experts who had sneaked into the Violet family had not been put in an important position for the time being. Under such circumstances, they could only rely on Su Chang'e and Ling Shuangxue to investigate the Violet family by themselves. So as soon as they arrived in Eastern Europe, the two big shots of Jade Pool went straight to Snow City. Without the intelligence of the Samsara Palace, they had to investigate everything about the Violet family by themselves. The support that the Samsara Palace and the Qin clan gave them was also fair. The other high-level members of the Snowdance Corps took the elites of the Snowdance Corps to the Morton family. What they got was the intelligence of the Samsara Palace and the support of the internal personnel. And their actions in the Violet family couldn't be carried out with great fanfare. They had to erase all traces. Because this was Snow Country. And the Violet family was the real ruler of Snow Country. The current president of Snow Country was from the Violet family. Snow Country was not the most powerful country in the world. Their economy was extremely chaotic, but they were one of the most powerful military powers in the world. This country with the largest land area in the world was very poor, but it was overbearing and arrogant. So it could be said to be the most powerful country in the world. And the current president of Snow Country could also be said to be the most powerful and iron-blooded president in the history of Snow Country. The Snowdance Corps wanted to destroy the Violet family, but no one could find the evidence. So the elites who participated in this action tonight were all unfamiliar faces in the dark world. They were extremely strange. They were extremely powerful. A total of 300 people. The super troops of the Lin clan. Xianyuan sword. In position. In position. In position. As the first voice sounded, countless voices responded at the same time. Su Chang'e's eyes had narrowed into slits. The roaring and raging sword energy in the mountains began to condense in an instant. The night, full of cold wind, was completely boiling. It was extremely abrupt, as if it had been prepared for a long time. Su Chang'e finally said, "Kill." His voice was like clear thunder. His voice reverberated in the air. In the next second, a deafening roar resounded throughout the entire Snow City. The interior of the Violet family was instantly ignited with fire. An extreme explosion broke out from the center of the Violet Manor. The waves of fire rose into the sky with black smoke. The violent explosions were continuous and came from almost every corner of the Violet Manor. A large number of elites of the Violet family were swallowed by the fire. Their bodies exploded, and their flesh and blood flew everywhere. In the fire, figures in black appeared one after another. Hundreds of people attacked at the same time and rushed over from all directions. Each of them wore an extremely strange silver mask on their heads. This was the first appearance of Xianyuan sword in the Dark World in nearly 20 years. There was no cold weapon that symbolized the identity of the super elites. Everyone wore a silver mask and held a silver gun in their hands. It was not a spear. It was a real gun that shone with silver light. The moment they rushed into the manor, every elite of Xianyuan sword pulled the trigger at the same time. There was no target, no aim. The shape of the silver gun was extremely strange, and the muzzle was thick. As they fired, the thick muzzle spat out balls of light in an instant. The balls of light fell to the ground and dispersed like water. The next second, they directly turned into electric arcs flying everywhere. The moment the electric arcs appeared, all the brilliant lights in the manor went out in an instant. All the instruments stopped working, and the communication signal above the manor completely disappeared. Hundreds of phones fired by guns frantically spread to all corners. A sharp sound that was enough to pierce people's eardrums suddenly sounded with the spread of the electric arcs, filling the entire manor. In an instant, a large number of manor guards suddenly covered their ears and fell to the ground, howling. Blood gushed out of their ears, eyes, noses, and mouths. The sharp sound swept across the manor. Countless people fell down with twisted faces, and some even began to spit out white foam. More than half of the countless guards in the manor fell down at a speed visible to the naked eye. Countless electromagnetic fields were still spreading on the ground, and eventually became the shape of bubbles, constantly bursting. The sound in the manor became sharper and sharper. Pulse hand cannon. Codename Armor Stripper. In the field of individual combat, this was the latest research result of the Lin clan. The powerful feature of pulse weapons was enough to destroy all signals on the battlefield in an instant, destroy human skills, and make people lose their combat effectiveness in an instant. Within the coverage of the armor-piercing hand cannon, elites below the fire-flaming realm would completely lose their combat effectiveness in an instant. Even those in the fire-flaming realm would have their strength greatly reduced. Only experts in the thunder-shocking realm could really be unaffected. But a large number of experts of the Violet family had gone to Reki City with the Violet family. How many experts in the fire-flaming realm and the thunder-shocking realm could there be in the manor today? The sharp buzzing soon passed. But the number of people who could stand on the ground in the manor had decreased by more than half. In the eyes of the elites of Xianyuan Sword, who wore special masks, everyone who was still standing in the field had become the most conspicuous target. The sudden war was extremely strange. In the silence, the elites of Xianyuan Sword rushed up like a pack of wolves. Fire and lightning bloomed at the same time. In an instant, they pierced through the 3 lines of defense of the Violet family and directly approached the center of the manor. Knowing this, in the luxurious villa in the center of the manor, a furious voice suddenly rang out. The voice was shrill and crazy, like a lion waving its sharp claws in vain after falling into a desperate situation. Who is it? Who dares to attack the Violet family? Damn it, you all deserve to die. Boom. The whole manor seemed to shake. With the lingering sound of anger, all the weapon defense systems in the Violet manor shook at the same time. But the electric arcs of the pulse weapons were still spreading in the manor. After a short shock, the defense system that the Violet family had spent a lot of money to build was less than 1/3 of the weapons that could be put into battle immediately. The battle broke out in an instant. The few elites left in the Violet family kept retreating under the attack of Xianyuan Sword and fled in a panic. The few mists in the manor began to condense light. The next moment, the roar of countless cannons suddenly sounded, and the wild explosion completely shook the night sky. A little white light suddenly lit up in the quiet and deep night sky. The white light suddenly dispersed in the absolute condensation and turned into countless light spots that fell to the ground. Under the night sky, it seemed that a rain of light had suddenly fallen in the silent lights. But as the rain of light fell, countless sharp sword energy rose wildly into the sky in an instant. The white spot in the air gradually became clear. Vaguely, it seemed to be the figure of a woman. She stood high in the sky and danced in the face of the whole sky. She was cold and penetrating, but the sharp and chaotic sword intent was gathering crazily toward her. The sword energy flew and turned into light curtains standing in the air one after another. The dancing trajectory of the white figure became more and more chaotic and erratic. The rain of light was falling all over the sky. The sword energy rising from the ground rushed into the sky. The sword energy tore up the light spots, and there were drifting light spots everywhere between heaven and earth. The figure that kept dancing high in the sky waved her long sword, and the bright blade suddenly stabbed down. The wind blew. The clouds surged. The wind was biting cold, and the night sky was rolling. Time seemed to freeze for a moment. The flying rain of light and the rising sword energy stopped at the same time and combined in an instant. In the blink of an eye, the sky and the earth formed a night curtain that almost covered the entire sky. It was gorgeous, beautiful, awe-inspiring, but with an indescribable solemnity. Anyone who practiced martial arts would be able to recognize this move. This was known as the most gorgeous and immortal sword move in the Dark World. People entered the secular world. The sword came out of the world. Jade Pool in Zhongzhou State. Heavenly flying immortal. At the same time, Eastern Europe. The sharpness of Zhongzhou State's phantom sword and Yinyang sword exploded in the headquarters of the Morton family. Yun Qinshi, Han Chongyang, Hua Qingfeng, Li Zhonghu, and other high-level members of the Snowdance Corps directly launched a surprise attack on the Morton family as soon as they received a clear signal. Blood flowed like a river, and there were cries everywhere. The entire Snowdance Corps seemed to have become extremely crazy under the leadership of Li Tianlan. The Violet family would not have expected that the Snowdance Corps would launch a surprise attack on them tonight. Neither would the Morton family. Most of the elites of the Snowdance Corps had to stay in the office of the president to imprison Wang Tianzong. In addition, the most powerful part of the Snowdance Corps was thrown to the Morton family by Li Tianlan. Even some high-level members of the Snowdance Corps did not know whether Li Tianlan was really confident or if he was completely crazy. However, the news from Reki City was obviously not optimistic. With the continuous loss of super high-end combat power, Li Tianlan was ready to take action in person. Ordinary elites might not understand what this meant. But every high-level member knew that Li Tianlan's action at this time meant that the situation was completely out of control. This was definitely enough to make people uneasy. On the extremely chaotic battlefield, when Li Wangxing once again pulled Li Zhonghu out of the desperate situation of certain death, the voice of the Lieutenant General of 9 regions, who had always been gentle and somewhat dull, was a little angry for the first time. "Old Li, what the hell are you doing?" Li Zhonghu shook his big head and said in a muffled voice, "Nothing." "Bullshit." Li Wangxing was a little flustered and exasperated. Tonight's surprise attack was perfect. The Morton family had insiders, and their side had absolute strength suppression. The battle should have been easy. But at this time, Li Wangxing had several more wounds on his body. The command of the entire Snowdance Corps had become a little chaotic. It was completely different from when they marched from Im to Ulan State. Li Zhonghu, the commander, was even a little absent-minded. The battle had been dragging on. No wonder Li Wangxing was a little annoyed. "You call this okay? If I hadn't taken action, you would have died at least twice." Li Zhonghu frowned tightly. He suddenly glanced at Li Wangxing and asked, "Aren't you worried about His Highness?" Reki City was their main battlefield tonight. But now the situation in Reki City was out of control. With only 2 invincible realm experts on his side, Li Tianlan had to face King Tong and Paul of Rothschild, Hostile, Violet, and Lagos. No matter how he looked at it, such a move was equivalent to courting death. Li Zhonghu did not intend to think about it. But the more he did not want to think about it, the more he could not calm down. If Li Tianlan really died, what was the meaning of their so-called Snowdance Corps' existence? Li Wangxing was stunned for a moment. He took a deep look at Li Zhonghu and softened his tone. "Don't worry," he said calmly, "young master will be fine." The corners of Li Zhonghu's mouth twitched, as if he were smiling. "Do you mean that His Highness will be fine facing 5 invincible realm experts, one of whom is Paul, who is close to the peak of the invincible realm?" "He'll be fine." The muscles at the corners of Li Wangxing's mouth twitched. He gritted his teeth and said, "Young master will definitely win." "How?" Li Zhonghu's voice suddenly rose for a moment, and then he lowered it again. "Why are you so sure?" Li Wangxing shook his head subconsciously, with a trace of confusion in his eyes. "I don't know either." He shook his head, but his voice was still firm. "But young master will definitely win. From the moment Wang Tianzong was imprisoned in the office of the president, we had already won. Because the situation that young master will face next is not important at all." His tone was a little stiff, as if he was comforting Li Zhonghu, but also as if he was comforting himself. "Who told you this?" Li Zhonghu narrowed his eyes and looked at Li Wangxing, his voice solemn. "It's..." Li Wangxing hesitated for a moment and said with a wry smile, "It's Senior Li." "Do you think Senior Li will hurt his grandson?" Chapter 510. It was the night of August 17th. Reki City was in chaos. The whole of Eastern Europe was in turmoil. In the capital of Snow Country, in the Holy Gorian Church, Patriarch Rock, who was the most low-key of the 4 patriarchs of the Eastern Church, had been praying for nearly 4 hours. The thick Bible was turning slowly and gently in front of him. The light in the prayer room was dim. The compassionate and holy statue looked extremely majestic. In front of the statue, Patriarch Rock knelt humbly and looked extremely pious. The Holy Gorian Church was not the largest church in Snow Country. It was not even the largest church in the capital of Snow Country. However, Patriarch Rock, one of the 4 patriarchs of Eastern Europe, was stationed here. In the hearts of all the Eastern Church believers, the Holy Gorian Church could be said to be the most sacred place. Patriarch Rock's prayer and Patriarch Hostille's action began almost at the same time. Patriarch Hostille led the elites of the Eastern Church south into Reki City. Patriarch Rock was praying for the future of all of Eastern Europe. The Holy Gorian Church was heavily guarded. Countless elites of the Eastern Church surrounded the entire church motionlessly. The closer they got to the center of the church where the Patriarch prayed, the fewer people there were, but their strength was getting higher and higher. There were only 2 guards guarding near the prayer room. But they were all famous experts at the peak of the thunder-shocking realm in Eastern Europe. The Eastern Church was indeed not as strong as the Vatican, which was famous all over the world, but no one dared to say that the Eastern Church was weak. The sphere of influence of the Eastern Church was mainly concentrated in the countries of Eastern Europe, and most of the believers were Eastern Church believers. For many years, even the Vatican had not been able to influence this place. This alone was enough to show the strength of the Eastern Church. There were no experts at the peak of the invincible realm in the Eastern Church, but in terms of foundation and comprehensive strength, at least in Eastern Europe, they could be completely fearless. His Highness Rorance and our allies have a great advantage. According to the latest news, they have suppressed the Snowdance Corps and the Vatican. The whole process is very smooth. Your Excellency Bolet, congratulations. The 2 guards outside the prayer room stood quietly like sculptures. In the silent atmosphere, the older guard suddenly turned his head to look at his colleague and congratulated him with a smile. Bolet was a little thin. He wore the armor of the Eastern Church, and his entire face was hidden in the helmet, so it was unclear. But as the other party spoke, his eyes suddenly lit up with excitement. That excitement quickly calmed down. Bolet bowed respectfully and said softly, "All of this is because of Captain Jiro's care and concern for me. Thank you, I will never forget everything you have done for me." Jiro's laughed with a happy and relaxed expression. He stretched out his hand and patted Bolet on the shoulder, saying softly, "Now you should consider who you want to take to Reki City. Of course, if you don't have a suitable candidate, I can recommend someone for you." Under the helmet, Beauregard lowered his head and said calmly, "Thank you very much, leader." Jiro smiled and narrowed his eyes. The look in his eyes became more and more satisfied. The Eastern Church also had something similar to the Holy Disarmament Corps. In the establishment of the Eastern Church, such a department was called the Knights of Light. There were 4 patriarchs in the Eastern Church. The Honorable Martial Banner of Knights had 4 commanders. Captain Jiros was the commander of the knights who served Patriarch Rock. He controlled a quarter of the power of the Knights of Light, and Bolet was his most important deputy. Among the 4 patriarchs, Rock and Patriarch Hostile had a very good personal relationship. Before this action, the 2 patriarchs had reached a consensus. In the Battle of Reki City tonight, if the Eastern Church could suppress the Vatican and the Snowdance Corps, the Eastern Church would establish a branch of the Knights of Light in Wulan State in an extremely strong manner, which could also be said to be a subordinate agency. For example, the relationship between Knights Templars and the Vatican. The new agency was called the Knights of Light, composed of elites led by Rock and Patriarch Hostile, and a small number of elite warriors of the other 2 patriarchs. Deputy Commander Bolet was the commander of the Knights of Light that both Rock and Patriarch Hostile thought highly of. The geographical location of Wulan State was extremely sensitive and special. If the Knights of Light were established, they would shoulder a very important mission from the moment of its establishment. Reki City was the main road between Eastern Europe and Western Europe, and the military would fight for it. Tonight, if Patriarch Hostile could expel the Vatican and the Snowdance Corps, once the Knights of Light were established, Bolet would become one of the most important figures in the entire Eastern Church. His status was no less than that of the 4 commanders of the Holy Punishment Knights, or even higher, because everyone knew that the Eastern Church's ambition was more than that. The Dark World had been too calm before, and the Vatican had been too strong, so the Eastern Church could only stay dormant in Eastern Europe. But tonight, The Eastern Church and Rothschild had joined forces, and the Violet and Morton families had joined in. As long as they could win tonight, the Qin clan and Rekvia in Eastern Europe would inevitably suffer heavy losses. The Snowdance Corps would also withdraw from Eastern Europe in embarrassment, and the strength of the Vatican would also be greatly damaged. Even if Arcis was lucky enough to survive, there was no need for Paul, who had exposed his strength, to continue to hide. At that time, the Knights of Light would use Wulan State as the foundation, unite Rothschild and the wealthy families of Eastern Europe, and march westward at the same time to take down the Vatican. That was a game that was destined to be magnificent. As long as they thought about it, everyone in the Eastern Church could feel their blood boiling. There was a flash of complacency in Jiros's distant and deep eyes. No matter what the final outcome of this game was, as long as the Knights of Light could be established in Wulan State, he would become the most powerful of the 4 knight commanders. Because Bolet was his man. A cold wind suddenly blew through the deep courtyard of the church. The cold wind blew into the prayer room, and the lights flickered for a moment. In the prayer room, the slight sound of pages turning stopped. The change was very small. Jiros didn't care. A cell phone suddenly rang. Jiros glanced down at the screen and answered the call. What? The person on the other side of the phone just reported, but Jiros suddenly exclaimed. His face changed dramatically, and he didn't come to his senses for a while. After a long time, he took a deep breath, suddenly turned around, and strode to the prayer room. Chief Knight, Bolet shouted subconsciously. I want to see the Patriarch. I have something very important to report. He pushed open the door of the prayer room. The lights were dim. The Patriarch knelt there, facing the statue. The Bible was open, but the pages were not turning. Jiros's heart was in a mess. But he still suppressed the anger in his heart and slowly said, Patriarch, I'm sorry to disturb your prayer, but I have something very important to report to you. The Patriarch knelt there, motionless. Patriarch. Jiros called again. The Patriarch's head seemed to have lost its support and slowly drooped. Jiros's heart suddenly sank to the bottom. He suddenly took a step forward and rushed directly to the Patriarch's side. Everything in his line of sight caused his eyes to become completely lifeless. The Patriarch closed his eyes. Blood was slowly flowing out of his chest. The dark red color soaked the red robe, which looked extremely strange. There was a dagger in his heart, a fatal stab. Jiros suddenly felt that it was extremely absurd. He couldn't even believe what he saw. Another cool breeze blew in his face. The wind was very soft. But the faint killing intent suddenly became extremely condensed. A subtle, almost invisible lightning was blooming and spreading, light and swift. Jiros suddenly came back to his senses and was instantly furious. Countless lightning bolts surged on his body for a moment. Damn it, whoosh! A huge force surged directly from behind Jiros before he could make a sound. Behind him, Bolet, whom he had always trusted, suddenly stretched out his hand and firmly controlled his body. This kind of control lasted for a moment. But a moment was enough. A gentle but cold breeze blew into the lightning around his body. A cold but perfect palm appeared in the dim light. The luster of the dagger flashed in his sight. The palm swept past his neck. The blade of the dagger tore Jiros's throat in an instant. Warm blood suddenly splashed out and gushed out like a fountain. Jiros's eyes widened. Feeling the blood gushing out of the gap in his body, he suddenly understood the cause of the Patriarch's death. It was impossible for someone to hide here in advance and kill Patriarch Rock. It was even more impossible for someone to sneak into the heavily guarded church. The only possibility was that the killer was carefully brought in and arranged here. It wouldn't be long. It happened half an hour ago at most. And half an hour ago, he happened to leave once. Jiros gritted his teeth and turned his head. Blood spurted out of his neck. He opened his mouth, but he couldn't make a sound. Bolet, who had suppressed him for a moment at the critical moment, was looking at him quietly. There was no pleasure, helplessness, guilt, or complacency in his eyes. His eyes were calm. It could even be said that he was very devout. Bolet seemed to see what Jiros wanted to ask. He drew a cross on his chest seriously and said calmly, Have you heard of the Protestant Church? Bang. Giros's pupils dilated for a moment. His body fell to the ground and he died with his eyes open. The wind hidden behind the statue blew over and quickly disappeared in the prayer room. The breeze was invisible. It was invisible and silent. It was silent. The duties of the 4 patriarchs of the Eastern Church were extremely clear. Patriarch Hostile, who was ranked on the divine list and could be said to be the top expert in Eastern Europe, was responsible for fighting. Patriarch Rock, who was the most low-key and devout, was responsible for consolidating the believers' faith. Patriarch Calendar was the most high-profile. He was also the patriarch that everyone in Eastern Europe was most familiar with. He was responsible for the internal and external affairs of the Eastern Church. Patriarch Marika was the most mysterious and was responsible for preaching. They were the 4 patriarchs of Eastern Europe. In the list of heresies of the Vatican, the importance of the 4 patriarchs could be said to be second only to Raphael, the leader of the Dark Knights. They were also the 4 most famous heresies in the heart of the Vatican. The strongest Hostile was defined as a killer by the Vatican. He was responsible for all the fighting affairs of the Eastern Church, and he was indeed the patriarch with the most blood on his hands. Rock, who was the most low-key but responsible for the core believers' faith, was defined as a controller. His brainwashing work was extremely successful even in the eyes of the Vatican. Countless fanatics were the biggest obstacle to the Vatican's conquest of Eastern Europe. Calendar, who was responsible for the internal and external affairs of the Eastern Church, was defined as a destroyer. The Vatican had never given up on Eastern Europe, but every time it infiltrated, it was eventually destroyed by Calendar. To some extent, he was a big heretic that the Vatican hoped to get rid of the most. Marika, who was responsible for preaching, was defined as a conspirator by the Vatican. In the field of religion, the preaching of the Eastern Church was equivalent to a war in the eyes of the Vatican. Such preaching was not simply about spreading faith. Specifically, how to weaken the strength of the Vatican. Developing his own believers was Marika's field of work. Tonight, when the battle in Reki City broke out, Patriarch Marika was holding an extremely mysterious meeting in a small city in the south of Wulan State. Marika did not think that Hostile would lose. He firmly believed that Wulan State would become an area controlled by the Eastern Church before the sun rose tomorrow. So in order to set off a religious war in the shortest time, the Patriarch summoned his 6 godsons at once. Without exception, all 6 godsons came from Europe, but not from Eastern Europe. France, England, Italos, the empire where the sun never sets, and Germany. 5 godsons came from these 5 countries, and they were all leaders of a certain wealthy family in their respective countries. And the last godson came from the Vatican. This was Marika's proudest achievement in recent years. After the Eastern Church occupied Reki City, the Morton family, the Violet family, and Rothschild would go all out to cooperate with them and spread the war of faith to the whole of Europe. These 6 godsons from Europe naturally had their own missions, and they were all extraordinary missions. He was a conspirator in the eyes of the Vatican, and he was best at conspiring. The meeting lasted for nearly 3 hours. Marika almost detailed every step of the operation. After confirming that there was no mistake, he ended the meeting. The 6 godsons left one after another. Patriarch Marika waited for a while before slowly walking out of the conference room. The venue of the meeting was not any secret place in the Eastern Church, but the only 5-star hotel in the city. 4 knights stood neatly outside the room. Among them, Knight Tang Minger, one of the 4 commanders of the Knights of Light, was also there. Seeing Patriarch Marika walk out of the room, Knight Tang Minger bowed slightly. "Let's go back." Patriarch Marika smiled faintly. His voice was soft and magnetic, carrying an extremely powerful appeal. Tang Minger nodded and led the way, while the other 3 knights followed behind. The night was getting darker. It was quiet in the corridor of the hotel. In the warm light, light footsteps sounded. A tall woman walked over. Her skin was fair, but it was not the kind of white that Europeans had. She looked like a Eurasian, and her golden hair swayed gently as she walked. The woman's pace was very lazy, but it was extremely enchanting. Tang Mingar looked at the woman's gently twisting body, and his eyes flashed with passion. The woman's appearance could not be regarded as a character, but she was very charming, and her every move was very seductive. Tang Mingar's eyes were a little hot. In such a serious scene tonight, he suddenly thought of a few Eastern European noble ladies with whom he maintained a private relationship. Tang Mingar shook his head in self-mockery, suppressed his inner desire, and glanced at the woman opposite him. Before the feeling of pity in his heart had subsided, a huge shock had already arisen. In his line of sight, the very elegant and feminine girl suddenly stopped in her tracks. Her eyes widened, and she looked behind them with a face full of horror. Tang Mingar instinctively sensed that something was wrong. Suddenly, a strange sound rang out from behind. The four knights turned around at the same time. A woman in a hotel uniform pushed a dining cart over, and her speed kept increasing. "Kill her!" Tang Mingar suddenly shouted and rushed to the dining cart without hesitation. The three knights beside him followed him instinctively. "Go!" A weak voice suddenly sounded, but this voice sounded like thunder in Tang Mingar's ears. It was the voice of Patriarch Marika. However, the voice stopped abruptly. Tang Mingar suddenly turned around. In his sight, the woman who had covered her mouth with a frightened face put down her hand. A steel needle fell out of his sleeve. His palm was slender but extremely thick. It was clearly a man's palm. A thought flashed across Tang Mingar's mind. Before he could move, the assassin who was dressed as a woman but looked so lifelike had already gotten close to Marika. The steel needle in his hand pierced through Marika's heart without hesitation. Countless electric arcs burst out in front of Marika's chest. They passed through his back and swept toward Tang Mingar with a large amount of blood. Tang Mingar pressed the alarm button in his hand and moved forward without hesitation. A shining tip of a sword pierced through his body from behind. The three knights beside the dining cart had already fallen. The woman in the uniform of a waiter held a long sword and pierced his heart. The assassin who killed Patriarch Marika took off his wig, mask, and women's clothes. The chaotic footsteps sounded. Countless knights of the Eastern Church rushed over. But he had completed the task and didn't care at all. Tang Mingar slowly fell down. A second before his life ended, he heard a voice. "Your Highness Li Tianlan sends his regards to the Eastern Church." The drifting clouds were formless, fearless and fearless, free and unrestrained. The ruins in front of the Caesar Hotel had completely disappeared. Everything in the surroundings had been completely erased from the intense battle. The originally bustling street was empty. The world was dead silent. The wreckage of the corpses was scattered everywhere. The blood spread into a river and flowed under their feet. The rain was still falling. On the ground, the blood-colored ripples kept spreading, which looked vivid and strange. Arcis, an expert at the peak of the invincible realm of the Vatican, was already covered in blood. He sat alone in the corpse-strewn battlefield, panting heavily. In this spacious and silent world, his panting was extremely ear-piercing, sounding extremely gloomy. In his sight, everyone had fallen down and turned into corpses. Only he was still alive. In the empty city, a lonely person. In the distant sky, it was raining wildly. Arcis gasped and was in a daze. At this moment, he suddenly felt extremely lonely, as if he was standing at the highest point of the world. His whole body seemed to be filled with a kind of loneliness from the inside out. Arcis sat on the ground, took out a cigarette, and lit it. For a moment, he was at a loss. Everything that happened tonight could be said to be the fiercest battle he had ever encountered in his life. But when the battle was over and the result was clear, what he felt was not joy, but confusion. King Tong's body fell in front of him. The blood covered her enchanting blonde hair, which looked extremely dirty. Beside King Tong, Paul, who only had a head left, died with his eyes open, but there was no sound. Raphael, the commander of the Dark Knights, who had always been regarded as the biggest heretic by the Vatican, had his heart pierced by a sword. The murderous weapon, Dark Saint's Spear, which was famous in the Dark World, was in his hand at this time. The body of the master of Samsara Palace lay there in the distance, a little blurred. Arsis had always been curious about the master of Samsara Palace. But now that the battle was over, he suddenly didn't want to take a look at her. Situ Tsangyue died beside the master of Samsara Palace. And in front of the lord of Sai City, Tribulation's body was split in half. The famous sword was still sharp, but Qin Shilai had become flesh and blood all over the sky. Countless corpses spread out from under Arisis's feet. Charlemagne, the president of the Heroes Club, Mitchell, Cass Rotter, Huan Kong, Violet, Lagos, and Hastile. All the Invincible Realm experts who could be named had turned into corpses. A little farther away, Lin Fengting, the patriarch of the Lin clan, also lay there quietly without a sound. Arsis suddenly laughed. Everything tonight broke out in chaos and abruptness. In the battlefield of the Caesar Hotel, their side had an absolute advantage, and his arrival made the victory completely tilted to their side. Without any hesitation, Arsis did his best to attack as soon as he arrived. He killed Paul in the shortest time, and then killed the Invincible Realm experts of the Violet family and the Morton family. The heretic Hastile, who was known as the Slaughterer in the eyes of the Vatican, surrendered to his power. And the Heroes Club, Fantasy World, the Men in Black and even the Snowdance Corps were all badly injured. After the coronation, Arsis, who was at the peak of his strength, did not hesitate to cooperate with the Snowdance Corps and kill Charlemagne, the president of the Heroes Club. Cass Rotter and Huan Kong also died under his absolute power. When only the Snowdance Corps was left on the battlefield, it was hard to say who would make the first move. The battle broke out without warning. In the end, Arsis killed all the strong enemies, including Lin Fengting, the patriarch of the Lin clan. His strength completely transformed in the high-intensity battle and went further from the peak of the Invincible Realm. Now he was still in the state of coronation. He had surpassed the peak of the Invincible Realm. In the state of coronation, he almost dared to fight with the real Chosen One. His current strength had even surpassed that of Pope Monlier, who was known as the greatest in hundreds of years. Arsis laughed maniacally. "This is my dark world. I am the king of the dark world. The only king. Ha!" The crazy laughter kept echoing. Near Arsis, a middle-aged man in a red robe quietly watched Arsis go crazy. There was undisguised mockery in his eyes. This was a middle-aged man about 50 years old. His handsome face was pale at this time, but his eyes were still calm. He quietly looked at Arsis, who was in a state of madness. His eyes were calm and motionless, like a statue. "You should rest in your residence in the middle of the night. You shouldn't come here." A voice suddenly sounded and fell into the ears of the middle-aged man. It also fell into Arisis's ears. The extremely silent world was instantly filled with this voice. "I shouldn't come here, come here, here." The echo was mighty and kept echoing between heaven and earth. Arisis's face suddenly changed. He suddenly looked up at the sky and said angrily, "Who is it? I've been looking for you for a long time." A hand fell on the middle-aged man's shoulder. A white figure seemed to come out of nothingness and stood beside the middle-aged man. The middle-aged man's face suddenly changed. Under the agitation of his emotions, he couldn't help but spit out a mouthful of blood. Puff! In Arisis's sight, heaven and earth suddenly shook. A bloody wind whistled past, and a rain of blood suddenly floated between heaven and earth. Arsis was stunned, and his eyes were a little blank. "You," the middle-aged man stared at the white figure in front of him. He was very familiar with the dark world. So he had identified the other party's identity when he came out of nothingness without any power fluctuation. This was not the other party's martial arts. There was only one piece of clothing in the dark world that could have such a weird hiding ability. The Azure Dragon armor of Zhongzhou State. Naturally, there was only one person who could wear this suit. Azure Dragon of Zhongzhou State. Gong Sunqi, are you playing a monkey here? Gong Sunqi looked at the middle-aged man in front of him. Are you Patriarch Calendar? What do you want? Calendar, whose face was pale, said slowly. His mind, which had been tense all this while, was completely shattered. At the same time, the world in front of Arsis turned upside down. The rain of blood disappeared. All the corpses also disappeared. The whole world was filled with the sound of wind and rain. The scene was empty and calm. Not far away, the roar caused by the fierce battle was faintly discernible. The battle did not stop. Sis was a little confused. "I don't want anything," Gong Sun-chi said blandly. "Zhongzhou State says hello to you." He waved his hand. But Calendar, who had exhausted all his physical strength, directly exploded into a cloud of blood mist. Gong Sun-chi watched the blood mist drift away expressionlessly. He suddenly looked up at Sis and asked curiously, "After the Pope's coronation, can you also be hypnotized?" The corner of Aris's mouth twitched, and his eyes became ashamed and furious in an instant. It was not until this moment that he realized what had happened. But this should not have happened at all. After the Pope's coronation, his will should have been extremely focused. But how could he be hypnotized by Calendar tonight and fall into his trap? Sis looked around. The corpses around him disappeared. But everything around him was indeed extremely empty. All the buildings around him were completely razed to the ground by the tremendous force. There was no doubt that this was Aris's masterpiece. In the state of hypnosis, all the enemies in front of Sis were really strong. The fierce battle made him squander his strength without reservation. But in fact, he had been standing here by himself, showing his strength at the peak of the invincible realm to the air and the surrounding buildings. When the absurd emotions rose, all Sis could feel was awkwardness. How is this possible? He didn't know why he was hypnotized in the state of coronation. But at this time he could clearly understand his state. In the illusion of hypnosis, all the enemies he met were really strong. After waking up from the confusion of squandering his power, Aris's physical strength and willpower had fallen to the lowest point. At this moment, Sis could even feel that the concentrated will of the Pope's coronation began to slowly decline. His peak period had been wasted by Calendar in the hypnosis. How was this possible? A mouthful of blood spurted out of Aris's mouth. The blood on the corners of his mouth in anger directly affected his excessive injury, and Aris's momentum suddenly dropped a lot. Gong Sun-chi's heart sank a lot. Sis, who had almost no combat power in this state, was not at the peak of the invincible realm. Damn it! Sis suddenly clenched his fists and growled, "The heretics of the Eastern Church deserve to die." There is another patriarch of the Eastern Church on the battlefield less than 5 kilometers away from here. Gong Sun-chi's voice was complicated. But in your current state, what can you do? Chapter 511. The emotions in Gong Sun-chi's tone were so complicated and tangled. Sis could clearly hear the complexity in his words. It was contempt, disappointment, and disbelief. It was a lot of emotions that Sis had never felt before. Almost in an instant, Sis completely calmed down. Everything was a little abnormal tonight. Among the 4 patriarchs of the Eastern Church, Patriarch Rock, the most low-key and pious controller, had profound attainments in the spiritual field. But now it seemed that Patriarch Calendar, the Destroyer, was no worse than Patriarch Rock in the spiritual field. This was a spiritual attainment close to the transcendent realm. If it got out, it would be enough to cause a stir in the dark world. Sis had no time to think about these questions. The only thing he wanted to know was how he was hypnotized. He had been crowned by the Pope, and his spiritual will was flawless. The greatly improved willpower also made him more focused on using his power, so that his strength could leap again on the basis of the peak of the invincible realm. Strictly speaking, he could not be hypnotized after the Pope was crowned. It was impossible for Calendar to do this in any case. But in fact, the most impossible thing had happened. He had fought endlessly in the illusion set up by Calendar, wasted all his physical strength, and was even seriously injured. In the illusion, he was invincible and stood at the peak of the world. But Gong Sun-chi pulled him back to the cruelest and coldest reality. The street was empty and calm. The buildings destroyed by Aris's great power turned into ruins and piled up on the ground. The roar of the battle in the distance was endless. Feeling the sense of weakness and powerlessness coming from all over his body, Arasus's face was ugly and cold. "How's the situation?" he asked suddenly. If Rothschild was destroyed tonight, many stories were bound to happen. But now Rothschild was still there, and Arcis had been trapped here for an unknown period of time. Under such circumstances, the Vatican and the Snowdance Corps were naturally still allies. "We lost," Gong Sun Chi said calmly. "In the battle tonight, the biggest accident was naturally that Paul exposed his strength that was infinitely close to the peak of the invincible realm. It was also an accident that Arcis, who was crowned by the Pope, was hypnotized by Patriarch Calendar." Gong Sun Chi saw very clearly that Arcis had clearly fallen into an illusion and could not extricate himself. If he had not come, this block could be regarded as the spiritual world of Patriarch Calendar. If he had come a little later, Arcis would have been at risk of dying. The suppression in the spiritual realm was far more tragic than that of martial arts. Arcis could not distinguish between illusion and reality. In the end, he could only fall in the illusion with an unparalleled sense of accomplishment. The Patriarch of Eastern Europe was almost lucky enough to kill the expert at the peak of the invincible realm of the Vatican that night. What did this mean? Gong Sun Chi knew very well that there was definitely something wrong with it. But the question was no longer important. The most important thing was that Arcis couldn't appear on the battlefield immediately, so the entire battle began to tilt in favor of Rothschild. "Lost?" Arcis raised his thick eyebrows and roared in a low voice, "But the battle is not over yet." "Does it matter? Mitchell, Huan Kong, and Cass Rotter have all died. Qin Shilai and Tribulation have also been seriously injured and left the battlefield. Now on that battlefield, Violet, Lagos, and Hastile have teamed up with King Tong Paul to kill the elites of several major forces. The battle is indeed not over yet. That's because the army of Wulan State has not been killed. What about you? What can you do in your current state?" Arasus's face was pale. Every time Gong Sun Chi said a word, his heart sank a little. By the time Gong Sun Chi finished speaking, the Saint War Angel of the Vatican's heart had sunk to the bottom. In any case, he did not expect that the situation of this war had become so serious. The Snowdance Corps and Wulan State will make their last efforts. But if the general trend is really irresistible at the last moment, Zhongzhou State can only choose to give up Wulan State. As for the Vatican, Gong Sun Chi's eyes were cold and indifferent. "Take care of yourself." The night wind blew over. Arcis suddenly felt a chill all over his body. But after all, he did not completely lose the ability to think. Gong Sun Chi's few words had already painted a picture of the battlefield and the future for him. "You mean Violet, Morton, and the Eastern Church are joining hands with Rothschild?" Gong Sun Chi did not speak and turned around expressionlessly. Arasus's eyes turned cold. At this moment, he did not think of Gong Sun Chi's rudeness, but the consequences if he lost the war tonight. The Snowdance Corps occupied Wulan State. Such a great advantage made Li Tianlan directly trigger the war tonight. Therefore, the Snowdance Corps could not afford to lose. Li Tianlan and the Li family could not afford to lose. Once they lost the war tonight, Li Tianlan and the Li family would be under tremendous pressure. But in the current situation, the Vatican could not afford to lose either. Rothschild, the Eastern Church, Violet, and Morton. Once the four of them occupied Wulan State together and took advantage of Wulan State to move westward, the elites of the entire Eastern Church could directly attack the Holy Land. The cooperation of the four forces could be said to be flawless. Rothschild could provide an incomparable foundation in Western Europe, and Paul was an absolute master who could restrain Arcis. The identity of the Eastern Church could always limit this invasion to the scope of a religious war, and it could also use the doctrines of the Eastern Church to influence the believers of the Vatican. The doctrines from the same Bible, even if there were differences, how big could they be? The Morton family could provide absolute wealth. Violet could use the unlimited political resources of Snow Country as a bargaining chip. It was not that the Vatican could not withstand such a lineup, but the significance of this matter did not lie in whether the Vatican could withstand it or not. For the Vatican, as long as the Eastern Church stepped into Western Europe, every time they developed a believer, it was a failure of the Vatican. At that time, the mystery of the Vatican and the majesty of the Saint War Angel would become a joke. Our sis hated it when someone made fun of him. Although he became a joke tonight, only Gong Sun Chi could see it. If the Vatican failed tonight, his joke would be seen by the whole world. Arisis's eyes became colder and colder. "Do you look down on me?" he asked suddenly. Gong Sun Chi's figure was about to disappear under the cover of the Azure Dragon armor. Hearing this, his figure paused slightly and turned around again. "What you did tonight is not worthy of respect." Gong Sun Chi said calmly, "At least as an ally, I can't understand." Our sis nodded. His expression was serious and calm. "This is an accident, but everything can be reversed." A crimson pill appeared in his hand. The pill was dark and scarlet, looking extremely strange. Without any hesitation, our sis swallowed the pill. The red pill melted in his mouth, and then it was like a fire that suddenly burned. The burning feeling flowed down his throat and burned his whole body. Arisis's body trembled violently, as if he was suffering great pain. His pale face turned ruddy in an instant, and an unparalleled violent momentum burst out. The domain of the peak of the invincible realm began to condense toward him. In an instant, a gust of wind was set off on the empty street. Gong Sun Chi stood on the edge of the domain. He was the strongest superior of the half-step invincible realm under the invincible realm, and he had the strongest combat capability of the invincible realm. Even if Li Tianlan rose, Gong Sun Chi was still the strongest under the invincible realm. But the strongest superior of the half-step invincible realm couldn't help but shake under the fluctuation of this domain, and he seemed to be a little unstable. Our sis closed his eyes and endured the pain in his body that almost tore his soul apart. The extremely violent effect lasted for about 10 minutes. Our sis slowly opened his eyes. His eyes were calm, and his aura was completely calm. "Let's go." Our sis glanced at Gong Sun Chi. "Let's go and have a look." "This is..." Gong Sun Chi opened his mouth, but he didn't finish his words. In the Dark World, there were many gene potions that could support experts to fight in various environments. Among them, there were many magical drugs that could temporarily restore the combat capability of seriously injured people. In many cases, this often meant another extra life. But such drugs were often only suitable for those below the invincible realm. There were very few drugs that could make an invincible realm expert recover from his injury and return to the peak state in an instant, and they were often accompanied by various sequelae, such as blurred willpower, confusion of friends and foes, and the more serious ones might even lower the realm. But the red pill in Arisis's hand obviously had no restrictions. He, who had returned to the peak state in an instant, could distinguish between friends and foes. In such a situation, he dared to take the pill, which even showed that he didn't need to pay too much later. Such a drug should be a treasure even in the Wang family of Beihai, which had the most powerful gene potion technology. The Vatican's research in this regard was not as good as that of the Wang family of Beihai, and compared with other developed countries, it had no advantage. What kind of drug was this? This is the latest achievement of the Vatican. There is only one of it, and it's with me. The muscles at the corners of Arisis's mouth twitched. This red pill was naturally not as good as the immortality potion, but it could make a seriously injured expert at the peak of the invincible realm return to the peak combat capability in an instant, which was enough to show how powerful it was. The code name of this medicine, Redemption, could be said to be the highest achievement of the Vatican in this regard. This was originally one of Arisis's trump cards. In his plan, this should have been the trump card to face Wang Tianzong in the final decisive battle in the chaos of Eastern Europe. But now, because of the Eastern Church, this redemption was wasted here. Because he couldn't afford to lose. Tonight, it was even more impossible for him to withdraw from Wulan state and let the Eastern Church enter Western Europe to touch the Holy Land. These heretics really deserve to die. Our sis narrowed his eyes, and there was infinite killing intent in them. At this moment, he did not deliberately show his strength, but he stood there, and he was already indomitable. Gong Sun Chi took a deep look at Arsis. After a long time, he bowed slightly and said, "Gong Sun Chi pays respect to your highness." Arcis did not speak. The suffocating sense of oppression in the field was still there. However, his figure had already disappeared. Gong Sun Chi stood up and looked at the sky. In the night, a violent and ostentatious killing intent roared and surged all the way away. Gong Sun Chi was silent for a long time before he slowly turned around. A gentle and quiet voice suddenly sounded behind him without warning. The voice was very, very close behind Gong Sun Chi. "Third brother? Did you kill Calland?" Gong Sun Chi's face changed dramatically, and he suddenly turned around. The surprise attack of freezing Snow City was like a real war. After the fighting, the explosion, and the flying blood fell, the sword light retracted, and the vast manor returned to peace. The war broke out abruptly. It also ended abruptly. In the Battle of Reki City, Violet took away more than 60% of the elite forces of the Violet family. In order to maintain the stability of Snow City, some of the experts in the manor were scattered all over the city. The most important thing was that the departure of Violet himself made the Violet family lose its most powerful deterrent. Under such circumstances, the sharpness of the Xianyuan sword troop was almost completely released from the very beginning. The pulse weapons cleared the field as soon as possible, and the remaining experts were few after the first charge of the Xianyuan sword troop. The heavenly fairy of Ling Shuangxue, the first elder of Jade Pool, blocked the counterattack of the fog defense system of the Violet family's headquarters. This was just the beginning. As soon as an expert of the half-step invincible realm and an expert at the peak of the thunder-shocking realm of the Violet family appeared, a sword strike that was more ruthless and decisive than the heavenly fairy had already broken out inside the manor. The famous sword snowblowing, heaven-shattering rainbow. With just one sword strike, the two strongest experts of the Violet family who stayed at the headquarters tonight had been smashed into pieces. From the attack to the patriarch of the Violet family, the raid of Xianyuan's sword took less than half an hour from beginning to end. On this night, the most important figures of the supreme Violet family in Snow Country were all exposed to the sharpness of the Jade Pool. Without any defensive measures, when facing death, the rich and powerful families were also trembling with fear. The blood beads on the snow blowing flowed down and dripped on the expensive carpet. Su Chang'e, who had only made one sword strike in the whole war, quietly looked at the crowd crawling at his feet. The patriarch of the Violet family, Tovo Granaski Violet, and all the important figures of the Violet family in the headquarters. The old patriarch of the Violet family, who was paralyzed in bed at the age of 80. Tovo's two younger sisters. An elder brother. In addition, there were a few children who looked no more than 5 or 6 years old. At this moment, all the members of the Violet family were huddled together, looking at Su Chang'e with undisguised fear and hatred in their eyes. "Mr. Su." A captain of the Xianyuan sword troop came over and said expressionlessly, "I've checked. In addition to the Violet family, there are 8 other members of the Violet family who are not here. They are all very important figures, and 2 of them are in Snow City. Send someone to kill them," Su Chang'e said in a flat tone. The captain nodded, turned around, and went to deploy. Su Chang'e's eyes fell on Tovo, the patriarch of the Violet family. He was silent for a while before he said calmly, "So, in tonight's raid, we actually only captured you, the most valuable hostage? There's nothing we can't talk about." Tovo took a deep breath. He was still in his pajamas. When the Xianyuan sword troops raided the manor, he happened to take off the clothes of a young female counselor who had recently been trained to be very obedient. He waved his hand, stood up tentatively, and said slowly and sincerely, "People of China, the Violet family is very willing to be friends with you. We can talk. I can call my wife now. She will come back with the elites of the family. No, she can even help you. You want to deal with Rothschild? Violet can help you." A member of the Xianyuan sword army came over, took a photo, and then retreated. "You can't kill me. It will destroy the relationship between Snow Country and Zhongzhou State. If we cooperate, all of Eastern Europe will be ours. Your young marshal has great power. He is a strong man. I'm willing to share Eastern Europe with the strong. Time will prove that cooperating with the Violet family is the best choice. Su Chang'e glanced at the elite who had just retreated. The other side nodded expressionlessly. Su Chang'e also nodded and glanced at Tovo. Are you done? Tovo's pupils shrank sharply. Time will prove that killing you tonight is the best choice. Su Chang'e said calmly. The snow-blowing sword made a very bright arc of light in the air. The arc of light flashed and then disappeared. A few drops of blood splashed out. A line of blood suddenly bloomed on Tovo's throat. The blood spurted out, looking strange and bloody. What right does a patriarch who is willing to hand over the power of the family to a woman have to talk about cooperation? Su Chang'e said indifferently. There was a sudden exclamation in the gorgeous hall. The rest of the old people, children, and women all huddled together, shivering. Su Chang'e glanced at them. Senior brother, what should we do with these people? Ling Shuangxue came over and asked. Su Chang'e's eyes shifted from the children to the old people. There was a touch of hesitation in his eyes. I can't get in touch with His Highness now, he said slowly. Maybe these people can be used to threaten Violet? Ling Shuangxue did not speak. There were indeed 2 children born to Tovo and Violet, a boy and a girl. The boy was close to adulthood, and the girl was only 5 years old this year. It was a good choice to use to threaten Violet. But Li Tianlan didn't seem to think about this problem from the beginning. His order was very simple, that was, to destroy the entire Violet family. No matter who won or lost the battle in Reki City tonight, the Violet family and the Morton family were bound to disappear in Eastern Europe. If the Snowdance Corps won, the Qin clan and Rekvia would get more and greater benefits in Eastern Europe in the future. Su Chang'e looked at the group of old, young, women and children in front of him, and his eyes were a little shaken. He saw cowardice, fear, and hatred in their eyes. After all, he was just a swordsman who lived in Jade Pool and rarely went down the mountain. Now he had destroyed the Violet family, but in the face of this group of old, young, women and children who had no power to fight back, he was at a loss for a moment. The elites of Xinyuan's swords slowly walked into the hall. They were also looking at this group of people who had no power to fight back, their eyes cold and silent. Su Chang'e suddenly felt a little sick. He shook his head hard and said, I'll make a phone call. Can't you get in touch with His Highness? Ling Shuangxue asked. Su Chang'e shook his head. I'll call Rushi. Maybe His Highness has other arrangements. The phone was quickly connected. Dongqing Rushi's clear voice sounded very soft. Master? Su Chang'e's inner struggle gradually calmed down. He smiled and said gently, It's me. Dongqing Rushi said honestly, Tianlan is not here. How are things on your side? Everything is going well. Su Chang'e looked back at the crowded hostages, sighed softly, and said, I still have some old people and children of the Violet family in my hands. They are all very important people. Rushi, does His Highness have any other arrangements? Dongqing Rushi also fell silent. Obviously, she also understood the meaning of this sentence. Su Chang'e quietly waited for Dongqing Rushi's answer. They are all enemies. After a long time, Dongqing Rushi said softly. But these are old people and children. Su Chang'e subconsciously raised his voice. The youngest child is less than 2 years old this year. After all, he couldn't accept what might happen next, so he directly expressed his position. Dongqing Rushi was silent. There was silence on the other end of the phone. After a long time, in the silence, Dongqing Rushi hung up the phone. She didn't respond to Su Chang'e's words in the end. No response was actually a kind of response. Su Chang'e's body was a little cold. He stood there for a long time, then glanced at Ling Shuangxue and said in a low voice, Let's go. The 2 swordsmen of Mount Shu slowly walked out. The elites of the Xinyuan sword troop stood quietly. The temperature in the hall became gloomy and cold. The door slowly closed. A child's cry suddenly sounded in the room. Sword intent spread out in the hall. The screams lasted for a moment and then disappeared. Su Chang'e didn't look back. He stepped on the flagstone road of the manor. Wherever he walked, a line of deep footprints was branded on the flagstone road, deep and clear. Senior brother, Ling Xianxia hesitated. Su Chang'e slowly shook his head and suddenly said, "Let's go back." Ling Xianxia was a little confused. She opened her charming and extremely moving eyes wide. "Go back to Zhongzhou State," Su Chang'e said in a low voice. He straightened his body and subconsciously looked in the direction of Reki City. In Reki City, Dongqing Rushi stood in front of the window and looked at the extremely deep night outside. The screen of the phone that hung up completely dimmed. The wind and rain were messy. She stood quietly. In the distant sky, the deep night seemed to turn into an extremely dark shadow. The shadow slowly drifted over and seemed to completely envelop Dongqing Rushi. In the gradually slanting sunlight, a black Rolls-Royce slowly drove into the hidden Dragon Sea and finally stopped in front of Jinqiu Pavilion. There was no secretary in front of the solemn gate of Jinqiu Pavilion. President Li Huaqing of Zhongzhou State stood at the door and looked at the approaching Rolls-Royce with a smile. A silent woman with an extremely fierce aura quickly got out of the car and opened the back door of the Rolls-Royce. Summer Solstice, the wife of the patriarch of the Wang family of Beihai, walked out of the car and shook hands with Li Huaqing with a smile. She said softly, "Mr. President, sorry to bother you." "Madam, you don't have to be so polite." Li Huaqing shook his head with a smile and reached out his hand. "Please." The hostess of the Wang family of Beihai, who had never stepped into the hidden Dragon Sea for more than 20 years, smiled lightly. But there was a kind of sharpness that seemed to have been forgotten gradually coming out of her. She was dignified and elegant, but irresistible. At the same time, under the sky of Beihai, in the laboratory of Mount Dibing, beside the huge bronze tripod, Wang Xiaoyao, who had been silent for a long time in the dark world and even in Zhongzhou State, put a box in the bronze tripod with a solemn face. The gigantic coldness of the 9 states stood there quietly, but the natural sword qi broke through the extremely sturdy box without anyone activating it. A black arm guard came out of the box. The arm guard began to spread slowly, with unparalleled spirituality, and wrapped around the coldness of 9 states. The broad body of the coldness of 9 states suddenly buzzed. In an instant, invisible but extremely sharp sword energy flew in every corner of the laboratory hall. Wang Xiaoyao watched this scene quietly. The black sword kept trembling. On the body of the sword, the sun, moon, stars, mountains, rivers, lakes, and seas seemed to be alive and became extremely vivid. The sword energy became more and more violent, but it was extremely sharp and clear. Looking at this scene, Wang Xiaoyao suddenly felt a little emotional. This was the first fusion of the divine weapon and the murderous weapon of the Wang family of Beihai. At this moment, was the human emperor moving? Or was the coldness of 9 states moving? He pressed a button beside him. A light shield gradually rose from the huge bronze tripod. The misty blue light rose and gradually enveloped the human emperor and the coldness of 9 states. It was sunny in Linen. The former Lonely Mountain had become today's Southeast Supervisory Council. The main building of the Supervisory Council had been completed. The engineering corps from the Lin and military region were still repairing other facilities in the Supervisory Council day and night. Li Honghe, dressed in plain clothes, sat quietly on a blue stone in the Supervisory Council, facing West Lake, silently watching the sun gradually setting in the west. In the dim light and shadow, an old man with a serious and dignified expression appeared. Li Honghe was stunned and smiled softly. The old man was followed by a few meticulous guards. The guards didn't stop until they got close to Li Honghe. The old man came over and sat down beside Li Honghe. He wanted to say something but stopped on second thought. "Can't sit still?" Li Honghe glanced at him and said with a soft laugh. "Reki City," the old man frowned tightly. "The situation is not good." "No, for us, the situation tonight is the best." Li Honghe smiled and suddenly said, "Do you believe me or not?" The old man glanced at him and thought, "Is it nonsense?" Li Honghe seemed to have gotten the answer. He nodded and said, "Since you believe me, stay for dinner tonight. When this big show is over, everything should be clear." At the same time, It was almost evening in Zhongzhou State. In the strong wind and heavy rain at Reki City International Airport, Qin Weibai also boarded the plane to Lin and Zhongzhou State. There was no flaming fire beside her. There was no Lin Fengting. She was alone. You're tuning in to the Wang Lin's Journey YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.